the forging of the ledger. The rain fell in sheets, turning the cobblestones of the capital into a slick, black mirror that reflected only misery. From the shadows of a narrow alley, 5 men watched the gallows. The tyrant's justice was swift and final. A baker, accused of hoarding a single loaf of bread, now swung from the end of a rope, his feet dancing a grotesque jig in the frigid air. His wife's screams had long since faded, silenced by the guards' mailed fists. Their children, now orphans, were being herded into a wagon destined for the salt mines. It was a scene that had become sickeningly common. The soldier, his hand clenching the hilt of a sword he could not draw, felt a familiar, useless rage burn in his chest. "I could have killed the guards," he rasped, his voice a low growl. "But not the garrison, not the legion that would follow." The merchant, a man whose face was a mask of pragmatic sorrow, shook his head. "Fighting is suicide. My ships are ready. We could flee, start new lives across the sea." "And leave our world to the wolves?" the priest countered, his knuckles white as he clutched the holy symbol hidden beneath his cloak. "We must have faith. We must pray for deliverance." The spy, a man who seemed more shadow than substance, watched, his eyes cataloging every detail, every guard's patrol route, every flicker of fear in the crowd. "Prayer will not move armies, and the sea is not wide enough to escape this blight." It was the scholar who finally broke the stalemate. He was a man of books and ink, not of swords or coin, but his eyes held a fire that dwarfed them all. He looked from the gallows to the faces of his companions, seeing their despair, their anger, their paralysis. "Then we must find a new way," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with a dangerous certainty. "Not with steel, nor with prayer, nor with flight, but with whispers." He gestured for them to draw closer, away from the prying eyes of the storm. "Meet me at the old scriptorium at midnight. The age of tyrants ends not with a bang, but with a secret." The air in the abandoned scriptorium was thick with the scent of decaying parchment and cold stone. A single candle cast long, dancing shadows across the faces of the 5 men huddled around a heavy oak table. The scholar unrolled a fresh, unmarked scroll, its blankness a stark contrast to the city's suffocating despair. "The tyrant's power is not in his armies," he began, his finger tracing invisible lines on the parchment. "It is in his control. He controls the grain, the gold, the information. He knows who is loyal and who is not. We will take that from him." He looked at the merchant. "Your ships carry more than just silk and spice. They can carry people. They can move grain to a starving town, while the tyrant's records show it rotting in a warehouse." He turned to Spy. "Your network of informants hears everything. They can spread a rumor that turns a general against his commander. They can learn where a family of fugitives is hidden and guide them to safety." His gaze fell upon the soldier. "Your discipline, your knowledge of logistics and tactics, you will teach us how to organize, how to create cells that operate in silence, invisible to the enemy, a brotherhood of shadows." Finally, he addressed the priest. "And you, my friend, you hold the people's hearts. You can offer sanctuary, a place of trust where the desperate can turn. You will be the moral compass in the darkness we are about to enter." He tapped the scroll. "We will build a new ledger, not of debts and credits, but of whispers and actions. A system hidden from the world that allows us to move resources, to protect the innocent, to undermine the tyrant's power, one quiet act at a time. It will be our sword, our shield, and our secret. We will call it the Ledger of Whispers." The scholar produced a small, sharp blade. Without a word, he drew it across his palm, the line of red, a shocking slash of life in the candlelight. He held his hand over the pristine scroll, allowing a single drop of blood to fall upon it, a crimson star on a field of white. "An oath," he said, his voice solemn. "With our blood, we swear it." One by one, the others followed. The soldier, his grip firm and unwavering. The merchant, his hand trembling slightly before he found his resolve. The spy, his movements quick and precise, a fleeting sting of pain. The priest, his eyes closed in prayer as the blood welled. 5 drops, 5 men, 1 purpose. "We swear our lives to this cause," the scholar intoned, their hands now clasped together over the scroll, their mingled blood a binding seal. "We swear to protect the innocent, to defy the darkness, and to serve the people, not ourselves." He paused, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn, impressing the weight of his following words upon their very souls. And we swear that this power we create, this ledger of whispers, will never be used for our own glory or gain. It is a tool, not a throne. When the tyrant is gone and the people are free, it must be unmade. Its secrets must die with us so that it may never become the very thing we seek to destroy. They stood in silence for a long moment. The gravity of their pact settled upon them. Then the scholar picked up a quill, dipped it in a pot of ink, and made the first entry. It was not a name, but a series of symbols, a coded message only they understood. A plan to move the baker's orphaned children from the slave wagon and spirit them away to a hidden monastery in the mountains. The Ledger of Whispers was no longer an idea. It was alive. Decades later, the Brute Brotherhood was no longer a desperate secret whispered in a dusty scriptorium. It was a legend, and Grandmaster Valerius was its lion. He stood before a vast, circular map of the known world, inlaid with brass and polished obsidian, in the heart of the Order's Grand Lodge. The chamber was a testament to their power: vaulted ceilings, tapestries woven in gold, and a silence heavier than any sound. Before him stood two ambassadors, their faces pale with fear and fury. Their nations, the twin powers of the North and the South, were poised on the brink of a war that would drown the continent in blood. "My king will not bow to these outrageous tariffs," the Northern ambassador declared, his voice tight with indignation. "Our armies are already massed at the border. We will have satisfaction." The Southern ambassador sneered. "Your armies will find only graves. The Southern legions have never known defeat. We will burn your fields and salt your earth before we yield a single coin." Valerius listened. His expression was one of supreme, almost dull indifference. He was a man carved from granite and authority, his presence filling the room, his eyes holding the cold, hard light of absolute confidence. He let the silence stretch, enjoying the way the two powerful men shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. He had not risen to become Grand Master of the Brotherhood through diplomacy or charm, but through an unbending will and a masterful understanding of power. Power, he knew, was not about the armies you commanded in the open, but the strings you pulled in the dark. Finally, he waved a dismissive hand. "There will be no war," he stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the marble floor. "The matter is already resolved. Go home. Your kings will have new, more pressing concerns by morning." The ambassadors stared, speechless. It was not a request. It was a decree. Alone in his private sanctum, Valerius approached the Ledger of Whispers. The humble scroll of the founders was a distant memory, a relic of a simpler, more desperate time. In its place stood a magnificent and terrible device. It was a complex astrolabe of interlocking brass rings, crystal lenses, and gears that clicked and whirred with a life of their own. At its heart, a sphere of milky quartz pulsed with a soft, internal light, the repository of 2 generations of secrets. This was the engine of the Brotherhood's power, the instrument of Valerius's will. His fingers, surprisingly nimble for a man of his stature, danced across a series of coded dials and levers. He did not need maps or charts. The entire political and economic landscape of the world existed within his mind. With a precise twist of a dial, he rerouted 3 grain shipments bound for the Northern Army's staging grounds, diverting them through a network of shell corporations to a port 1,000 miles away. The army would have no bread within a fortnight. Another series of clicks and a forged letter, penned in the perfect hand of the Southern King's most trusted spymaster, was dispatched. It contained fabricated intelligence about a planned betrayal by the king's leading general, a man known for his ambition. The seeds of paranoia were sown. Finally, he focused a lens on a small, insignificant island, the home of the Northern King's secret mistress, the one person whose influence he valued above all others. A quiet command was sent through the network. She would be given a gift, a rare and untraceable poison that would mimic the symptoms of a sudden, tragic illness. Her death would plunge the king into a grief so profound he would lose all appetite for war. Valerius stepped back, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. No armies, no battles, no bloodshed. Just whispers. The founders would be proud, or so he told himself. The soft glow of the ledger bathed Valerius's face in an ethereal light, making him look like a priest before a holy altar. He felt the familiar surge of pride, the intoxicating certainty that he and he alone held the fate of nations in his hands. The founders had dreamed of a tool to protect the innocent. He had perfected it into a weapon to command the powerful. It was a necessary evolution. The world was a brutal, chaotic place, and only a firm, unseen hand could impose order upon it. His hand. He ran a hand over the cool brass of the device, a gesture that was almost a caress. The ledger was more than a machine. It was an extension of his own mind, his will made manifest. It knew the secret debts of every merchant, the hidden loyalties of every general, the quiet fears of every king. It was the ultimate power, and it belonged to the Brotherhood. It belonged to him. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime, a signal from the ledger itself. A minor alert. He glanced at the projected script that hovered in the air of the quartz sphere. It was a resource allocation query from one of the lower-level cells, a request for grain and medical supplies for a small, plague-ridden village in the western provinces. A place called Oak Haven. Valerius frowned. He vaguely recalled the matter being brought before the council. The request had been denied. Oak Haven was of no strategic or economic importance. Sending aid would be a waste of resources, a sentimental gesture that served no larger purpose. He keyed in the command to dismiss the alert, but it chimed again, more insistent this time. The resources had already been moved. A ghost in the machine. A flicker of defiance. For the first time in a decade, the ledger had done something he had not commanded. A cold knot of anger tightened his stomach. It was impossible, unthinkable. The lower archives of the Grand Lodge smelled of lamp oil and old secrets. Kalen moved through the narrow aisles between towering shelves of coded ledgers, his fingers trailing along the spines of bound volumes that chronicled decades of the Brotherhood's hidden work. He was young, perhaps 25, with the lean build of a man who had trained hard but never seen actual battle. His eyes, however, held an intensity that belied his years, the eyes of someone who questioned everything, even when silence would be safer. He found Serafina exactly where he expected her, hunched over a desk in a pool of golden light, surrounded by scattered parchments and half-empty ink bottles. She was a few years older than him, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and ink stains on her fingers that were never quite washed away. She had been raised within the Brotherhood, the daughter of a master archivist, and she knew the organization's history better than anyone alive, save perhaps Valerius himself. That knowledge had made her dangerous. She saw the patterns, the slow drift from purpose to power. "You heard about Oak Haven?" she said without looking up, her voice flat. Kalen nodded, though she could not see it. The council denied the request. Valerius confirmed it this morning. He paused, the words bitter on his tongue. He called it a waste of resources on strategic irrelevance. Serafina's quill stopped mid-stroke. She set it down carefully, as if it were something fragile, something that might shatter. 300 souls, men, women, children, dying of a plague we could cure with medicines we have stockpiled in a warehouse not 50 miles away. She finally looked up at him, and her eyes were not sad. They were angry. When did we become accountants of suffering, Kalen? When did we start measuring lives by their strategic value? Kalen pulled a chair close and sat, his voice dropping to a whisper. The archives were supposed to be secure, but the Brotherhood had taught him well. Walls had ears, and shadows had eyes. It's been happening for years. I've been tracking it. He produced a folded parchment from inside his coat and spread it on the desk. It was a meticulously drawn chart showing resource allocations over the past decade. Look at the pattern. Aid to villages, to people experiencing poverty, to those with no political power declined by 70%. Meanwhile, expenditures on strategic initiatives, bribes, blackmail, political manipulation, have tripled. Serafina studied the chart, her jaw tightening. She had suspected it, but seeing it laid out so starkly was different. It was proof. The founders created the ledger to protect the powerless. Valerius has turned it into a weapon to control the powerful. She traced a finger along one of the lines, a sharp downward slope. He's forgotten the oath. Or worse, he's decided it no longer matters. I tried to bring it up in the junior council meeting last month, Kalen said, frustration bleeding into his voice. I suggested we revisit our core mission, refocus on direct aid. I was told, very politely, to remember my place and trust the wisdom of the Grand Master. He clenched his fists. Trust, as if trust means blind obedience. Serafina met his gaze, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were not alone in their doubts, but they were alone in their willingness to voice them. The Brotherhood was built on a secret, she said slowly, carefully. Perhaps it's time we learned to keep a secret from the Brotherhood. She gestured to the chart. If the Council will not act, if Valerius will not listen, then we must find another way. The ledger is vast. Surely, somewhere in its complexity, there is room for discretion. Kalen stared at her, the implications of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. You're talking about using the ledger without authorization, about going behind Valerius's back. It was not a question. It was confirmation of a line they were about to cross. I'm talking about remembering what the ledger was created for, Serafina countered, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she rolled up his chart and handed it back to him. The founders swore an oath. We swore an oath when we joined, to protect the innocent, to serve the people, not ourselves. Valerius has broken that oath. If following his orders means abandoning ours, then yes, I am talking about defiance. Kalen felt a thrill of fear and exhilaration. He had always been a loyal member of the Brotherhood, a believer in its mission. But loyalty to an ideal and loyalty to a man were not the same thing. If we're caught, we'll be expelled, possibly imprisoned. Valerius does not tolerate disobedience. Serafina's expression was grim but resolute. But if we do nothing, if we stand by and watch the Brotherhood become everything it was created to oppose, then what are we? What is the point of all this secrecy, all this power, if we use it only to serve ourselves? Kalen thought of the 300 souls in Oakhaven, dying while medicine rotted in a warehouse. He thought of the founders, 5 desperate men who had bled together and sworn an oath in a forgotten scriptorium. He thought of the man he wanted to be and the man he would become if he chose silence over action. The choice, he realized, had already been made. Tell me what you need, he said. Tell me how we do this without getting caught, and then let's save Oakhaven. Serafina allowed herself a small, fierce smile. First, we need to understand the ledger better than Valerius does. The Grand Hall of the Brotherhood was a monument to power disguised as restraint. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, held aloft by columns of black marble veined with gold. Tapestries depicting the Brotherhood's most significant and most secret triumphs hung from the walls, their threads woven with actual gold and silver. The long banquet table, carved from a single massive oak, could seat 50, but tonight it hosted only the inner circle. These 12 masters advised Valerius and controlled the Brotherhood's most sensitive operations. Kalen stood against the wall with the other junior members, present to serve and observe, but not to speak. It was a privilege to attend these gatherings, a sign of favor and a step toward eventual elevation to the council. He had once been honored by the invitation. Now, as he watched the masters gorge themselves on delicacies while discussing the fates of nations, he felt only disgust. Valerius sat at the head of the table, a goblet of wine in his hand, his expression one of benign satisfaction. He raised the goblet, and the room fell silent. To the Brotherhood, he intoned, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast space. To the unseen hand that guides the world toward order. To the power that protects the weak by controlling the strong. To the Brotherhood, the masters echoed, raising their own goblets. The sentiment sounded noble. It had once been noble. But as Kalen watched them drink, watched them laugh and boast of their latest manipulations, he saw only men who had grown fat on secrets and drunk on control. They were no longer protectors. They were puppet masters, and they reveled in it. Serafina, standing across the hall, caught his eye. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he saw the same revulsion mirrored there. They were surrounded by power, and they had never felt more powerless. The feast continued, course after decadent course, roasted meats glistening with fat, fruits imported from distant lands, pastries dusted with sugar that cost more than a farmer's yearly income. Master Corvus, a portly man with a red face and a booming laugh, regaled the table with a story of how he had manipulated a trade dispute to bankrupt a merchant guild that had refused to pay tribute to the Brotherhood. The other masters chuckled appreciatively. They thought they could operate outside our influence, Corvus said, wiping grease from his chin with a silk napkin. I simply rerouted their shipments, spread a few rumors about the quality of their goods, and within 3 months, they were begging us for a loan. At a very favorable interest rate, of course. More laughter. Kalen's hands clenched behind his back. He forced himself to remain still, to keep his face blank. Across the table, Master Lucian, a thin, ascetic man who rarely smiled, leaned forward. And what of the guild members themselves? The craftsmen and their families? Corvus shrugged. Dispersed. Some found work elsewhere. Some did not. It was a lesson, Lucian. The Brotherhood's authority must be respected. Mercy is a luxury we cannot afford if we are to maintain order. Indeed, Valerius said, his voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. All eyes turned to him. The world is not kind to the weak, my brothers. We learned that lesson long ago. Our power is not a gift, it is a burden. We bear it so that others need not. We make the hard choices so that the masses can sleep soundly in their ignorance. He paused, his gaze sweeping the table, and for a moment, it landed on Kalen. That is the price of order. That is the cost of peace. Kalen met his gaze and did not look away. It was a small act of defiance, but it was all he could offer at that moment. The banquet finally ended near midnight. The masters, sated and drowsy, departed to their private chambers within the lodge. Kalen and the other junior members were dismissed to clear the table and extinguish the lamps. It was menial work, designed to remind them of their place. Kalen welcomed it. It gave him time to think, and more importantly, it gave him access. He worked slowly, methodically, waiting until the other juniors had finished and left. Seraphina lingered as well, ostensibly polishing the silver goblets, but her eyes were on the doors, watching, waiting. When they were finally alone, she moved to his side. "Did you hear, Corvus?" she whispered, her voice tight with anger. "He destroyed an entire guild, ruined hundreds of lives, and they laughed. They laughed, Keelan." "I heard," he said quietly. He glanced toward the head of the table where Valerius had sat. "And I heard Valerius justify it. The price of order, as if cruelty and control are the same as peace." He set down the plate he was holding, his hands shaking. "My father was a craftsman, a carpenter. He belonged to a guild. If the Brotherhood had decided his guild was inconvenient, he would have been dispersed. My mother, my sisters, they would starve. And men like Corvus would have laughed about it over wine." Seraphina placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "Then we make sure Oakhaven does not starve. We make sure the Brotherhood remembers what it was supposed to be, even if we have to do it in secret." She pulled a small folded piece of parchment from her sleeve and pressed it into his hand. "I found it. A back door in the ledger's code. The founders built it in as a failsafe in case the system was ever corrupted. It allows for resource allocation without council approval, but it requires 2 operators working in tandem, you and me." Kalen looked down at the parchment, then back at her. "When do we start?" "Tonight," she said, "before we lose our nerve." The ledger of whispers hummed in the darkness of the lower chamber, its crystalline heart pulsing with soft, rhythmic light. Kalen and Seraphina stood before it, their faces illuminated by its ethereal glow. The chamber was forbidden to all but the Grand Master and the senior council members. Being here without authorization was a violation punishable by immediate expulsion, or worse. Kalen's heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady as he followed Seraphina's whispered instructions. "The founders built the ledger with a dual-key system," she explained, her fingers dancing across a series of hidden glyphs etched into the brass framework. "It requires 2 operators to access the deepest functions, a safeguard against any single person wielding absolute power." Valerius has spent decades convincing everyone, including himself, that he alone controls it. But the founders were wiser than that. Kalen positioned himself on the opposite side of the device and found the matching set of glyphs. "And you're certain this won't trigger an alert?" "The back door was designed to be invisible to the primary operator," Seraphina said, though her voice carried a thread of uncertainty. "In theory, Valerius won't know we've accessed the system unless he's actively monitoring this exact function at this exact moment. And given that it's past midnight and he's likely asleep in his chambers..." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "We have to trust the founders knew what they were doing." "On 3, Kalen said. They counted together, their voices a synchronized whisper, and pressed the glyphs simultaneously. The ledger's hum deepened, and a new interface materialized in the air, the quartz sphere, lines of shimmering script that neither of them had ever seen before. Serafina exhaled slowly. We're in. Now let's save Oak Haven. The script flowing through the air was dense, complex, a language of symbols and numbers that represented resources, locations, and pathways. Serafina navigated it with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying the Brotherhood's archives, her fingers tracing patterns that caused the script to shift and reorganize. Here, she said, highlighting a cluster of symbols. Medical supplies? Warehoused in Greystone, 43 miles from Oak Haven. Enough to treat the plague and have surplus for future outbreaks. Kalen studied the adjacent data. It's marked as strategic reserve. If we divert it, someone will notice eventually. Eventually, it is not tonight, Serafina replied. She began inputting commands, her movements quick and precise. We'll route it through 3 intermediary points. Make it look like a standard redistribution for inventory balancing. By the time anyone questions it, the supplies will already be in Oak Haven, and the plague will be contained. They can't unsave lives. Kalen watched the commands take effect, watched the ledger reroute carts and requisition orders, watched a dozen unsuspecting Brotherhood operatives receive instructions they would assume came from Valerius himself. It was elegant, it was efficient, it was precisely the kind of manipulation the Brotherhood had perfected. The only difference was the purpose. What about food? He asked. The report said the quarantine has left them unable to harvest their fields. Medicine won't matter if they starve. Serafina nodded and shifted the interface. Grain stores in Millhaven, marked for export to the capital, but it's been sitting in silos for 2 months. We divert half. Millhaven won't miss it, and Oak Haven survives the winter. Her fingers flew across the glyphs, and more commands cascaded through the ledger. Anything else? Kalen thought for a moment. Blankets. Clean water. A healer who knows how to administer the medicine. Serafina smiled grimly. Now you're thinking like a founder. She kept working, and the ledger obeyed. They worked for nearly an hour, meticulously crafting a web of orders and diversions that would funnel aid to Oak Haven without raising immediate suspicion. When they finally stepped back, the ledger's interface faded, returning to its normal, passive state. The device hummed contentedly, as if pleased to be used for its original purpose. Kalen felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror. They had done it. They had defied the Grand Master and used the Brotherhood's most powerful tool to save lives that Valerius had deemed expendable. How long before someone notices? He asked. Serafina closed the hidden panel that concealed the dual-key glyphs. Days, maybe a week. The Brotherhood's logistics network is vast and decentralized. Low-level operatives follow orders without questioning their origin. By the time the discrepancy reaches someone senior enough to investigate, the aid will have already arrived. She turned to face him, her expression serious. But Kalen, once they start investigating, they will find us. The ledger keeps logs. We can obscure them, delay discovery, but we cannot erase them. Valerius will know. Then we make it worth it, Keelan said. Oak Haven is just the beginning. If the council won't honor the founder's oath, we will. Every village they ignore, every plea they dismiss, we'll answer it. We'll be the Brotherhood the founders intended, even if we have to hide from the Brotherhood Valerius has created. Serafina studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You understand what you're proposing? We're not just bending the rules. We're starting a shadow war within our own organization. If we're caught, Valerius won't just expel us. He'll make an example of us. I know, Kalen said, but I'd rather be an example of defiance than a participant in corruption. He extended his hand. Are you with me? She clasped his hand firmly. Until the end, whatever that looks like. Senator Tiberius Marcellus was a man who understood the currency of resentment. He sat in his private study, a room lined with books he had never read and art he had never appreciated, and stared at the letter in his hand. It was a refusal, polite but firm, from the Brute Brotherhood. His request for a loan to cover his mounting debts incurred through bribes, lavish parties, and a lifestyle far beyond his senatorial salary, had been denied. Grand Master Valerius himself signed the letter. Tiberius reread the final line. The Brotherhood does not extend credit to those who have demonstrated fiscal irresponsibility. We suggest a more disciplined approach to your personal finances. Fiscal irresponsibility. Disciplined approach. The words were a slap, a condescension that burned hotter than any open insult. Tiberius had clawed his way up from the minor nobility, had schemed and backstabbed his way into the Senate, and now this shadowy cabal of self-righteous hypocrites dared to lecture him? The Brotherhood, who operated outside the law, who manipulated kings and toppled governments, who hoarded wealth and power in secret, dared to judge him? He set the letter down carefully, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. He had known of the Brotherhood's existence for years. Every powerful man did, though few spoke of it openly. They were useful fiction, a convenient scapegoat when things went wrong, and an even more convenient ally when things went right. But Tiberius had never needed them before. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of politics without outside help. Now, in his moment of need, they had spurned him. Worse, they had humiliated him. Valerius had made it clear that Tiberius was beneath the Brotherhood's notice, unworthy of their assistance. That, Tiberius decided, was a mistake, a fatal one. Tiberius rose from his desk and moved to the window, gazing out at the city below. The capital sprawled in every direction, a chaotic tapestry of wealth and poverty, power and desperation. Somewhere in that maze, the Brotherhood operated, pulling strings, moving pieces, playing their grand game. They thought themselves untouchable. They thought their secrecy made them invincible. But Tiberius knew the truth that Valerius, in his arrogance, had forgotten. Every secret was a vulnerability, and every hidden power was a target. He had spent years cultivating his own network of spies and informants. They were not as sophisticated as the Brotherhood's, but they were loyal, motivated by coin and fear in equal measure. Over the past months, he had tasked them with a single objective: learn everything about the Brute Brotherhood, their operations, their resources, their weaknesses. The reports had been slow to come, but they had come, and what they revealed was fascinating. The Brotherhood was not a monolith. It was an organization of men, and men had ambitions, jealousies, and doubts. There were factions within the lodge, and tensions between the old guard and the younger members. And at the center of it all was Valerius, a man whose iron grip on power had begun to breed resentment. Tiberius smiled. Resentment was a currency he understood very well. He returned to his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment. He would not confront the Brotherhood directly. That would be suicide, but he did not need to. He needed to apply pressure, to exploit the cracks, to turn their own people against them. And when the Brotherhood was weakened, when Valerius was vulnerable, Tiberius would strike. He would take everything they had built, their ledger, their network, their power, and he would use it to reshape the world in his image. The Brotherhood had made an enemy. They would soon learn the cost of that mistake. Tiberius began to write, his quills scratching across the parchment with swift, decisive strokes. The letter was addressed to no one, but it would find its way to the right hands. He had learned the identities of several mid-level Brotherhood operatives, men who carried out orders but were not privy to the inner circle's deliberations. Men who might be persuaded with the right incentive to share what they knew. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. It did not openly solicit betrayal. Instead, it posed as a concerned inquiry from a fellow patriot worried about the Brotherhood's recent activities. It hinted at rumors of corruption, of the organization straying from its noble purpose. It suggested that true loyalists within the Brotherhood might seek reforms to restore the organization to its original ideals. And it provided a secure channel for anyone who wished to discuss these concerns further. Tiberius knew that most recipients would ignore the letter or report it to their superiors. But he only needed one disgruntled operative, an idealist who felt betrayed by Valerius's leadership, one ambitious fool who thought he could play both sides. That single thread would be enough to begin unraveling the tapestry. He sealed the letter with plain wax, bearing no mark or sigil, and summoned his most trusted courier. "Deliver this to the names on the list," he instructed. "Do not be seen. Do not be followed. And if you are caught, you know nothing of its contents or its origin." The courier nodded and disappeared into the night. Tiberius returned to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Somewhere out there, Valerius sat in his lodge, confident in his power, blind to the storm gathering on the horizon. You should have given me the loan, Tiberius murmured to the darkness. Now I'll take everything. 3 days after their midnight operation, Kalen stood in the Grand Lodge's morning briefing room, his face a careful mask of attentive neutrality. Master Lucian was reviewing the week's operational reports, his dry, precise voice cataloging shipments, political maneuvers, and intelligence gathered from a dozen nations. Kalen's heart hammered in his chest, waiting for the moment when Lucian would mention Oak Haven, when the discrepancy would be discovered and the hammer would fall. But the moment never came. Lucian moved through the reports with mechanical efficiency, nothing unusual, flagging no irregularities. When he reached the logistics section, he paused only to commend the smooth redistribution of medical supplies from Greystone, calling it an exemplary demonstration of resource optimization. Kalen forced himself not to react, not to glance at Seraphina, who stood across the room with the same careful blank expression. The briefing concluded, and the assembled members dispersed to their various duties. Kalen waited until he was alone in the corridor before allowing himself to exhale. They had done it, the aid had reached Oak Haven, and the Brotherhood's vast bureaucracy had absorbed the transaction as routine. The ledger's logs showed the diversion was authorized. The operatives who executed the orders never questioned their origin, and the council remained blissfully ignorant. He found Seraphina in the archives an hour later. She was shelving books, but her hands trembled slightly. "Did you hear Lucian?" she whispered. "He praised the redistribution. He actually praised it." Kalen nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "The system is so complex, so layered, that even the masters don't see the whole picture. Valerius built a machine so vast that it operates beyond his comprehension. The founder's failsafe isn't just a back door. It's a blind spot." That evening, Seraphina spread a map across the desk in her small quarters within the lodge. It was not an official Brotherhood map, but one she had been compiling for months. A chart of the places the council had ignored, the villages and towns deemed strategically irrelevant. There were dozens of them, scattered across the continent like forgotten stars. Oak Haven was just one. "If we can do it once, we can do it again," she said, her finger tracing a route from the lodge to a cluster of villages in the eastern provinces. Here, 3 farming communities that sent requests for aid after floods destroyed their harvest. The council denied them because they produce flags, not grain. Flax has no strategic value, so they're expendable. Kalen studied the map, his mind already working through logistics. What do they need? Seeds for replanting. Tools to repair their irrigation systems. Food to last until the next harvest. Seraphina pulled out a ledger of her own, filled with notes and calculations. "We have surplus seeds in the northern warehouses. Tools were stockpiled in the capital. And grain, always grain. The Brotherhood controls enough food to feed a nation, but we hoard it for leverage. Then we give it to them," Kalen said. "Not as leverage, not as a political tool, just as aid, the way the founders intended." He looked up at her. "But we need to be smarter this time. We need to establish a pattern that looks intentional, not random. If we're going to operate in Valerius's blind spot, we need to make sure it stays blind." Seraphina nodded slowly. "We create a false narrative. A new initiative, buried in the ledger's logs, appears to be a low-priority outreach program. Something boring and bureaucratic that no one will scrutinize. We call it the Provincial Stability Project. Aid to economically insignificant regions to prevent unrest. Valerius loves preventing unrest." Kalen smiled. "You're brilliant. Let's build it." They worked through the night, constructing a phantom initiative within the ledger's vast architecture. It was painstaking work, requiring them to forge authorization codes, backdate reports, and create a paper trail suggesting the Provincial Stability Project had been approved months earlier by a subcommittee so minor no one would remember its deliberations. Seraphina's knowledge of the archives was invaluable. She knew which records were rarely audited, which officials were too busy to question routine approvals, and which bureaucratic channels were so convoluted that no one would trace them to their origin. By dawn, the project existed. It had a budget, drawn from a dozen different discretionary funds in amounts too small to trigger alerts. It had a mandate, vague enough to justify almost any action. And it had two operators, Kaylin and Serafina, listed as junior coordinators responsible for implementation. To anyone who bothered to look, and Serafina had designed it so that no one would like precisely the kind of tedious, well-intentioned program that large organizations created to justify their existence. "It's perfect," Kaylin said, staring at the glowing script above the ledger. "It's so boring that it's invisible." Serafina allowed herself a tired smile. The founders understood that the greatest power is the power no one notices. Valerius forgot that. He wants everyone to know the Brotherhood is powerful, to fear it, to respect it. But the founders knew that true power is quiet. It moves in the margins, in the spaces between the grand gestures. She closed the interface, and the ledger returned to its passive state. Now we use that power the way it was meant to be used. Keelan looked at the map still spread on the desk, at the dozens of forgotten villages waiting for help that would never come through official channels. "How many do you think we can save?" "All of them," Serafina said. "One at a time, until Valerius notices, or until we change the Brotherhood from within. Whichever comes first." The aid reached the eastern villages within a week. Keelan and Serafina monitored the reports through the ledger's network, watching as seeds were planted, tools distributed, and granaries filled. The official logs recorded the transactions as routine expenditures under the Provincial Stability Project, and no one questioned them. But the unofficial reports, the ones that came through the Brotherhood's field operations, the ones that described the people's reactions, told a different story. A young operative named Matthias, stationed in the eastern provinces, sent a message that Serafina read aloud to Kaylin in the privacy of the archives. The villagers wept when the supplies arrived. They had been preparing to abandon their homes, to migrate to the cities, and join the ranks of the desperate poor. They said it was a miracle. They asked who sent the aid, and I told them it came from the Brotherhood. An old woman kissed my hand and said, "Tell your masters that we will remember their kindness." I did not have the heart to tell her that the masters would not care. Kaylin felt a tightness in his chest. They think the Brotherhood saved them. They think Valerius saved them. Does it matter? Serafina asked quietly. The aid reached them. Lives were saved. Isn't that the point? It matters, Kaylin said. His voice was harder than he intended. Because when Valerius finds out, and he will see it as a theft of his authority, not a fulfillment of his duty. He'll punish us for making the Brotherhood look compassionate without his permission. He paused, then added more softly, "But you're right. It doesn't change what we did. Those people are alive because we acted. That's what the founders would have wanted." Serafina folded the message carefully. Matthias is a good man. He sees what we see. Maybe he's not the only one. Maybe there are others in the Brotherhood who remember the oath. Over the following weeks, Kaylin and Serafina expanded their operations. They sent medicine to a mining town suffering from lung disease. They diverted construction materials to a coastal village, rebuilding after a storm. They arranged for a teacher to be sent to an isolated mountain community where children had never learned to read. Each action was small, easily hidden within the ledger's vast flow of resources. But together, they began to form a pattern, a quiet rebellion against the Brotherhood's drift toward power for its own sake. The field reports continued to arrive, and they were universally positive. The people they helped did not know Kaylin and Serafina's names, but they knew the Brotherhood had come to their aid when no one else would. Gratitude turned to loyalty, and loyalty turned to hope. In villages forgotten by the powerful, the Brotherhood's symbol, a clenched fist holding a single candle, began to appear on doors and walls, a sign of solidarity and trust. But not everyone was pleased. In the Grand Lodge, Master Corvus reviewed a financial report and frowned. "There's a discrepancy in the discretionary funds," he announced during a council meeting. "Nothing significant, but the expenditure has increased by 12% over the past month. Most of it is going to this Provincial Stability Project. Does anyone know what that is?" Valerius, presiding over the meeting, glanced at the report with mild interest. "A subcommittee initiative, I believe. Low priority. Lucian, you chair that subcommittee, don't you?" Master Lucian looked up, momentarily confused. "I chair several subcommittees, Grandmaster. I would need to review the records to confirm." Do so, Valerius said dismissively. If it's a waste of resources, shut it down. If it's effective, let it continue. I trust your judgment. He moved on to the following item on the agenda, and the moment passed. Kalen, standing against the wall, felt a cold sweat trickling down his spine. The clock was ticking. That night, Serafina found Kalen on the lodge's rooftop, staring out at the city lights. The capital sprawled below them, a glittering expanse of wealth and poverty, power and desperation. He did not turn when she approached, but he knew it was her. Corvus noticed, he said. I know. I was there. She stood beside him, her arms crossed against the cool night air. But Valerius dismissed it. We have time. How much time? Kalen asked. A week? A month? Lucian is meticulous. When he reviews the records, he'll see the Provincial Stability Project for what it is, a fiction. And then he'll trace it back to us. Then we use that time, Serafina said. We help as many people as we can before the door closes. And when Valerius confronts us, we tell him the truth. We tell him the Brotherhood has lost its way, and we were trying to bring it back. Keelan finally turned to look at her. He'll destroy us. Probably, she agreed. But we'll have saved lives, we'll have proven that the Founder's vision still matters. And maybe, just maybe, we'll inspire others to continue what we started. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Kalen, we knew this would end badly the moment we accessed the ledger without permission. The question was never whether we'd be caught, but whether what we did before we were caught would be worth it. He looked back at the city, at the countless lives unfolding in the darkness below. Somewhere out there, in villages and towns, the Brotherhood had deemed irrelevant. People were planting seeds, rebuilding homes, teaching children. Because of them, because two people had chosen defiance over obedience. It's worth it, he said quietly. Whatever happens, it's worth it. Serafina nodded. Then we keep going. Until we can't anymore. Master Lucian was a man who lived for order. His private study was a testament to that philosophy. Every book alphabetized, every document filed with precision, every surface free of dust or clutter. He sat at his desk now, surrounded by ledgers and reports, his thin fingers tracing columns of numbers with the focus of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. The Provincial Stability Project had seemed innocuous at first, a minor line item in the Brotherhood's vast budget. But the more he examined it, the more irregularities he found. The project had supposedly been approved 6 months ago by the Subcommittee on Regional Affairs, a body that Lucian nominally chaired but rarely convened. He had no memory of such an approval, which was unusual. Lucian prides himself on his meticulous record-keeping. He pulled the meeting minutes from that period and found a brief notation, motion to establish Provincial Stability Project approved unanimously. But there were no details, no discussion, no explanation of the project's scope or purpose. He cross-referenced the authorization codes embedded in the ledger's logs. They were valid, properly formatted, and traced back to his own administrative authority. Yet he had never issued them. It was as if the project had materialized from thin air, cloaked in legitimacy, but lacking substance. Lucian leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. A clerical error? Unlikely. The Brotherhood's bureaucracy was complex, but it was not sloppy. A forgotten initiative? Possible, but he would have remembered something this significant. Or, and this thought sent a cold shiver down his spine, someone had created the project without authorization, using the ledger itself to forge the necessary approvals. If that were true, it meant the ledger had been compromised. And if the ledger had been compromised, the Brotherhood's entire foundation would have been at risk. Lucian reached for a quill and began drafting a report for Valerius. This required the Grand Master's immediate attention. The next morning, Lucian presented his findings to Valerius in the Grand Master's private chambers. The room was austere despite its size, furnished with only a desk, a few chairs, and the ever-present hum of the ledger's secondary interface, a smaller version of the main device that allowed Valerius to monitor operations from anywhere in the lodge. Valerius listened in silence as Lucian explained the anomalies, his expression unreadable. You're suggesting someone accessed the ledger without authorization, Valerius said when Lucian finished. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a dangerous undercurrent that Lucian had learned to recognize over the years. I'm suggesting it as a possibility, Grandmaster, Lucian replied carefully. The alternative explanations are less troubling, but also less plausible. If the ledger's security has been breached, we need to identify the source and contain it immediately. Valerius rose from his chair and approached the secondary interface. His fingers moved across its controls with practiced ease, pulling up the logs Lucian had referenced. He studied them for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "The authorization codes are mine," he said finally. "Or rather, they appear to be mine, but I did not issue them." He turned to face Lucian, and his eyes held a cold fury. "Someone has learned to mimic my authority within the ledger. That should be impossible." "The founders built safeguards into the system," Lucian ventured. "Redundancies and fail-safes to prevent any single person from wielding absolute control. Perhaps one of those safeguards has been activated." Valerius's expression darkened. "The founders are dead, Lucian. Their safeguards are relics of a naiver time. I have spent decades mastering this system, bending it to my will. If someone believes they can undermine me using the founders' outdated idealism, they will learn otherwise." He returned to his desk and sat, his posture rigid with barely contained anger. "Find them. Whoever is behind this, find them and bring them to me." Lucian bowed and left the chamber, his mind already racing through the logistics of the investigation. He would need to audit every transaction associated with the Provincial Stability Project, trace every authorization code, and interview every operative who had executed the orders. It would be a monumental task, but Lucian was nothing if not thorough. He returned to his study and began assembling a team of trusted analysts, men and women whose loyalty to the Brotherhood and to Valerius was beyond question. But even as he organized the investigation, a small part of Lucian's mind lingered on Valerius's reaction. The Grand Master's anger had been immediate and intense, but there had been something else beneath it. Fear. Valerius was afraid, not just of the security breach, but of what it represented. The ledger was the source of his power, the instrument through which he controlled the Brotherhood, and by extension, much of the world. If that instrument could be turned against him, if others could wield it without his knowledge or consent, then his authority was not absolute. It was conditional, fragile. Lucian had served Valerius for over 2 decades. He had watched the man transform the Brotherhood from a desperate resistance movement into a shadow empire. He had admired Valerius's strength, his vision, his unwavering commitment to order. But he had also watched the Grand Master grow more isolated, more autocratic, more convinced of his own indispensability. The founders had sworn an oath that power would never corrupt their mission. Valerius had reinterpreted that oath to mean that his power was the mission. Lucian shook his head, banishing the disloyal thoughts. He had a task to complete. He would find the infiltrators and deliver them to Valerius. What happened after that was not his concern. He was a servant of the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood's survival depended on maintaining the Grand Master's authority, even if that authority had become something the founders would no longer recognize. In the village of Thornhaven, 200 miles from the capital, a young woman named Alara stood in the center of the newly rebuilt town square and addressed a crowd of her neighbors. She was not a leader by training or temperament, but necessity had thrust the role upon her. The floods had destroyed their homes, their fields, their livelihoods. The local lord had offered no aid, the crown had sent no relief, and they had been preparing to scatter, to abandon the land their families had worked for generations. Then the Brotherhood arrived. "They came with seeds and tools," Alara said, her voice carrying across the square. "They came with grain to feed us through the winter. They asked for nothing in return. No taxes, no oaths of fealty, no demands for labor. They simply gave, and then they left." She held up a small wooden token carved with the Brotherhood's symbol, a clenched fist holding a candle. "They left us this, and they told us to remember that we are not forgotten, that someone, somewhere, still believes we matter." The crowd murmured in agreement. An old man stepped forward, his weathered face creased with emotion. "My grandfather told me stories of the Brotherhood. He said they were heroes once, in the dark times, when tyrants ruled and the people had no voice. I thought they were just stories, but they're real. They're still fighting for us." Alara nodded. "Then we fight for them. We rebuild, we plant, we survive. And when others ask how we endure, We tell them the truth. The Brotherhood saved us, and if they saved us, they can save others. She raised the token high. We are not forgotten, and we will not forget. The crowd erupted in cheers, and the sound carried across the fields, a declaration of hope in a world that had offered them only despair. In villages and towns across the continent, similar scenes were unfolding. The Brotherhood's quiet rebellion was becoming a movement. Word of the Brotherhood's renewed compassion spread faster than Kaelin or Seraphina had anticipated. Merchants carried the stories from town to town. Travelers spoke of villages saved from ruin by mysterious benefactors. Ballads began to appear in taverns, singing of the shadow guardians who moved unseen but left hope in their wake. The Brotherhood's symbol, once a mark of fear and respect among the powerful, was becoming a symbol of salvation among the powerless. In the Grand Lodge, the shift in public perception went unnoticed. Field operatives sent reports describing the growing adulation, the way people spoke the Brotherhood's name with reverence rather than suspicion. Master Corvus read one such report during a council meeting and scoffed. The rabble are singing our praises. How quaint. Perhaps we should charge them for the privilege. But Master Lucian, still deep in his investigation, saw a different pattern. The praise is concentrated in regions associated with the Provincial Stability Project, he noted, his voice thoughtful. The villages receiving aid are not strategically important, but they are becoming ideologically significant. The people see the Brotherhood as their protector, not their manipulator. It's a dangerous shift. Dangerous? Valerius asked, his tone sharp. Explain. The Brotherhood's power has always rested on secrecy and fear, Lucian said. We operate in the shadows, and the powerful respect us because they know we can destroy them. But if the common people begin to see us as heroes, as saviors, they will expect us to act like heroes. They will demand accountability, transparency, and compassion. They will expect us to serve them, not control them. He paused. And if we fail to meet those expectations, their adulation will turn to betrayal. We will have created a constituency we cannot satisfy and cannot silence. Valerius's expression hardened. Then we find whoever is responsible for this shift, and we end it. The Brotherhood does not answer the mob. We answer to no one. That evening, Kaelin received a message from one of the field operatives, a woman named Isla, stationed in the southern provinces. The message was brief but urgent. The people are organizing. They want to thank the Brotherhood. They want to meet the ones who saved them. What should I tell them? Kaelin showed Seraphina the message, and they sat in stunned silence. They had not anticipated this. They had thought their actions would be invisible, a quiet correction to the Brotherhood's course. But they had underestimated the power of hope. In a world where the powerful preyed on the weak and the systems of governance served only the elite, even a small act of genuine compassion was revolutionary. The people were not content to be saved in silence. They wanted to be part of something larger. We can't meet them, Seraphina said finally. If we reveal ourselves, Valerius will know. And if Valerius knows, this ends. But if we don't respond, if we let them organize without guidance, they'll create a movement we can't control, Kaelin countered. They'll start making demands, expecting the Brotherhood to be something it's not. And when Valerius crushes them, and he will, their hope will turn to ashes. Seraphina looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Then we have a choice. We can stop now, let the movement die, and hope Valerius never traces it back to us. Or we can embrace it, guide it, and accept that we're no longer just reforming the Brotherhood from within. We're starting a rebellion. Kaelin thought of Alara in Thorn Haven, holding up the Brotherhood's symbol and declaring that they would not be forgotten. He thought of countless others like her, people who had been given a reason to believe in something better. We can't stop, he said. Not now, not when we've given them hope. We see this through, wherever it leads. Master Lucian's investigation bore fruit within a fortnight. His team of analysts traced the Provincial Stability Project's transactions back through the ledger's labyrinthine logs, following the digital breadcrumbs with relentless precision. The trail led to a series of access points in the lower archives, timestamps corresponding to late-night hours when the lodge was nearly empty, and finally to two names, Kaelin Thorne and Seraphina Vela. Junior members, both promising, both trusted, both traitors. Lucian presented his findings to Valerius in the Grand Master's chambers, laying out the evidence with clinical detachment. Valerius listened in silence, his face a mask of stone. When Lucian finished, the Grand Master rose and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice so cold it seemed to leach the warmth from the room, he spoke. "Bring them to me. Now." Lucian bowed and left to carry out the order. Within the hour, Kalen and Seraphina were escorted to the Grand Master's chambers by a contingent of the Brotherhood's enforcers, men whose loyalty to Valerius was absolute. Keelan's heart pounded as they entered, but he kept his head high. Seraphina's hand brushed against his, a brief, reassuring contact. They had known this moment would come. They had prepared for it as best they could. Valerius stood with his back to them, his hands clasped behind him. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked without turning. "Yes, Grand Master," Keelan said, his voice steady. "You've discovered what we've been doing." "What you've been doing," Valerius repeated, his tone laced with contempt. He finally turned to face them, and his eyes burned with a fury that was all the more terrifying for its control. "You have stolen from the Brotherhood. You have undermined my authority. You have used the ledger, my ledger, to pursue your own agenda. Do you deny it?" "No," Seraphina said. "We do not deny it." Valerius took a step toward them, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. "Then you will explain yourselves. You will tell me why 2 junior members, sworn to obey the Brotherhood's hierarchy, believed they had the right to act without authorization. You will tell me why you thought you could betray me and escape consequences." Kalen met his gaze without flinching. "We didn't betray you, Grand Master. We upheld the oath we swore when we joined the Brotherhood. The oath to protect the innocent, to serve the people, not ourselves. The same oath the founders swore when they created the ledger." "Do not lecture me about the founders," Valerius snapped, his voice rising. "I knew them. I learned from them. I built this organization into what it is today. Everything you see, everything the Brotherhood has accomplished, exists because I had the strength to do what they could not. I made the hard choices. I wielded the power they were too weak to use." "You wielded it for yourself," Seraphina said, her voice quiet but firm. "The founders created the ledger to protect the powerless. You've turned it into a weapon to control the powerful. You've forgotten the people we were supposed to serve. Oak Heaven was dying, and you called them strategically irrelevant. 300 souls, Grandmaster. How many more have you dismissed? How many more will you let suffer because they don't serve your vision of order?" Valerius's hand shot out, slamming against the desk with a force that made the wood shudder. "My vision of order has kept this continent from tearing itself apart. My vision has prevented wars, toppled tyrants, and created stability where there was only chaos. You think compassion is enough? You think good intentions will save the world? The founders tried that, and they died in obscurity, their work nearly forgotten. I ensured their legacy endured. I made the Brotherhood matter." "At what cost?" Keelan asked. "What good is a legacy built on betraying the very ideals it was meant to uphold?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Valerius stared at Keelan, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling with suppressed rage. For a moment it seemed he might strike him, might unleash the full weight of his fury. But then, with visible effort, he regained his composure. "You are children," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "You see the world in simple terms, good and evil, right and wrong. You have no concept of the complexity, the compromises, the sacrifices required to maintain order. You have taken my mercy for weakness, my patience for approval. That ends now." He turned to the enforcers. "Confine them to the holding cells. They are to speak to no one, see no one, until I decide their fate." He looked back at Kalen and Seraphina, his expression one of bitter disappointment. "You could have been great. You had potential, but you chose sentimentality over strength, and now you will pay the price." As the enforcers moved to take them, Kalen spoke one last time. "The people know, Grandmaster. They know the Brotherhood helped them. They're organizing, spreading the word, expecting more. You can imprison us, but you can't imprison the hope we've given them. The Founders' vision isn't dead. It's alive in every village we saved, in every person who believes the Brotherhood still stands for something more than power. Valerius's eyes narrowed. Then I will show them what the Brotherhood truly stands for. I will show them the cost of defiance. And when I am done, they will remember that hope is a luxury only the strong can afford. He waved a hand. Take them away. Kaelin and Seraphina were led from the chamber, their hands bound, their future uncertain. But as they descended into the depths of the lodge, Kaelin felt no regret. They had lit a spark. Whether it would ignite a fire or be snuffed out, only time would tell. But it had been worth it. News of Kaelin and Seraphina's imprisonment spread through the Brotherhood's network like wildfire, carried by sympathetic operatives who had witnessed the confrontation or heard whispers in the lodge's corridors. Within days, the news reached the villages and towns they had saved. In Thornhaven, Alara stood before the rebuilt town square and read aloud from a hastily printed pamphlet that had appeared overnight, distributed by unknown hands. The Shadow Guardians have been imprisoned by their own order. The ones who saved us are now condemned for the crime of compassion. The crowd that had gathered erupted in outrage. An old farmer, his face weathered by decades of hard labor, raised his fist. They saved my grandchildren from starvation. What crime is there in that? The crime of defying power, Alara said, her voice trembling with anger. The Brotherhood's masters want us to be grateful in silence, to accept their charity when it suits them, and starve when it does not. But Kaelin and Seraphina showed us a different way. They showed us that the Brotherhood was meant to serve us, not control us. A young man pushed forward. Then we march. We go to the capital, to the Grand Lodge, and we demand their release. They'll never listen to us, someone called from the back. We're peasants. We're nothing to them. Alara climbed onto a wooden crate so all could see her. Then we make them listen. We are nothing. We are the people they swore to protect. And if they have forgotten that oath, we will remind them. She held up the Brotherhood's symbol, the clenched fist holding a candle. We march, not with weapons, but with voices. We march for Kaelin and Seraphina. We march for ourselves. Who stands with me? The square erupted in a roar of affirmation. The uprising had begun. The march from Thornhaven was joined by villagers from a dozen other communities along the road to the capital. What began as a few hundred grew to thousands, a river of humanity flowing toward the seat of power. They carried banners emblazoned with the Brotherhood's symbol, not as a mark of allegiance to the organization, but as a declaration of what they believed the Brotherhood should be. They sang songs of hope and defiance, ballads that had been composed in taverns and fields, celebrating the Shadow Guardians who had dared to remember the people. Valerius received reports of the march with cold fury. He stood in the Grand Lodge's war room, surrounded by his council, and watched as markers on the map showed the uprising's progress. They're calling it a pilgrimage, Master Corvus said, his voice dripping with disdain. A peaceful demonstration. They claim they only want to petition for the prisoner's release. Peaceful, Valerius repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. They march on the lodge with thousands, and they call it peaceful. This is insurrection, thinly veiled as piety. He turned to Master Lucian. What is the city guard's readiness? The guard can disperse them, Lucian said carefully, but it will not be bloodless. These are not trained soldiers or organized rebels. They are farmers, craftsmen, families. If we use force, we will be slaughtering the very people the Brotherhood was founded to protect. The Brotherhood was founded to impose order, Valerius snapped. And order requires that defiance be met with consequences. If we allow this mob to dictate terms, we lose all authority. Every village, every town will believe they can challenge us with impunity. He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward. We do not negotiate with insurgents. We remind them of their place. Master Corvus nodded eagerly. I can have the guard mobilized within the hour. But Lucian's expression remained troubled. Grand Master, if we act with brutality, we risk turning martyrs into legends. Before Valerius could respond, the doors to the war room burst open. A junior operative, breathless and pale, stumbled in. Grand Master, the march has reached the city gates. They're not stopping. The guard tried to turn them back, but they're unarmed. There's nothing to arrest them for. They're just walking, thousands of them, and the city's own people are joining them. Valerius's jaw tightened. He strode to the window and looked down at the streets below. From his vantage point, He could see the edges of the crowd, a sea of bodies flowing through the capital's avenues like a tide. They were chanting now a single word repeated: freedom. 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 He turned back to the council. Do they want freedom? They have no idea what freedom costs. They live in ignorance, shielded from the chaos that would consume them without our guidance. And now they dare to demand that we release the traitors who undermined that guidance. His voice rose, echoing through the chamber. I will not be dictated to by a mob. I will not allow sentiment to destroy what I have built. Master Lucian stepped forward. Then what do you propose, Grandmaster? We cannot arrest them all. We cannot kill them all. If we act with violence, we prove their accusations true, that the Brotherhood has become the very tyranny it was created to oppose. Valerius was silent for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities, strategies, and outcomes. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and decisive. We give them what they want. We release Kalen and Seraphina. The council stared at him in shock. But, he continued, we do so on our terms. We make it clear that their release is an act of mercy, not capitulation. And we ensure that this uprising ends today, permanently. Corvus frowned. How do we ensure that, Grandmaster? Valerius smiled, but there was no warmth in it. By making an alliance with someone who understands the necessity of order, someone who will help us remind the people of their place. The gates of the Grand Lodge opened at dawn, and Kalen and Seraphina were brought forth, blinking in the sudden light. They had spent 3 days in the holding cells, isolated and uncertain of their fate. Now, they stood at the top of the lodge's grand staircase, looking down at a sea of faces, thousands of people who had marched for them, who had risked everything to demand their freedom. The sight was overwhelming, humbling, and terrifying all at once. Valerius stood beside them, his expression carefully neutral. He raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent, the sudden quiet more powerful than any shout. People of the realm, he began, his voice amplified by the lodge's acoustic design, carrying across the square. You have come to petition for the release of these 2 members of the Brotherhood. You have made your voice heard, and I, as Grand Master, have listened. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Valerius continued. Kalen Thorne and Seraphina Vale acted without authorization, but they acted with conviction. They believed they were upholding the Brotherhood's founding principles, and in that belief, they were not entirely wrong. The Brotherhood was created to serve the people, to protect the innocent, to stand against tyranny. Perhaps, in our pursuit of order, we have lost sight of that purpose. Kalen stared at Valerius, stunned. This was not the man who had condemned them 3 days ago. This was a performance, a calculated display of magnanimity. But to what end? Therefore, Valerius said, I am releasing them. And more than that, I am announcing a new initiative. The Brotherhood will establish a formal charter, a set of principles that will guide our actions and hold us accountable to the people we serve. A constitution, if you will, that enshrines the founder's vision and ensures that no one, not even the Grand Master, can stray from it. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Kalen felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. This was too easy. Valerius never surrendered. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the capital had seen in decades. The people flooded the streets, singing, dancing, embracing strangers as if they were family. Vendors gave away food and drink, musicians played on every corner, and the Brotherhood's symbol was painted on walls and banners throughout the city. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy, the belief that change was possible, that the powerful could be moved by the voices of the powerless. Kalen and Seraphina were swept into the crowd, hailed as heroes, as the catalysts of a new era. Alara found them in the chaos and threw her arms around Seraphina, tears streaming down her face. You did it, she sobbed. You changed everything. But Seraphina's expression was guarded. She pulled Kalen aside, away from the press of bodies, into a quieter alley. This doesn't make sense, she said, her voice low and urgent. Valerius doesn't capitulate. He doesn't compromise. Why would he agree to a constitution that limits his power? Maybe we actually won, Kalen said, though he didn't believe it. Maybe the uprising forced his hand. Maybe he realized he couldn't maintain control through fear alone. Or maybe, Seraphina said, he's planning something. A constitution is just words on paper, Kalen. It only has power if it's enforced. And who enforces it? The Brotherhood, which means Valerius. She looked back at the celebrating crowd, her eyes filled with worry. We need to be careful. This feels like a trap. Kalen wanted to argue, wanted to believe that their defiance had actually achieved something lasting. But he had seen the look in Valerius's eyes when he announced the Constitution. It was not the look of a man who had been defeated. It was the look of a man who had just made a move on a chessboard that his opponents did not yet understand. Then we stay vigilant, he said. We make sure the Constitution is real, that it has teeth. And we don't let our guard down. Serafina nodded, but the unease did not leave her face. That night, as the city continued to celebrate, Valerius sat in his private chambers with an unexpected guest. Senator Tiberius Marcellus had arrived under cover of darkness, admitted through a side entrance known only to the Brotherhood's inner circle. He sat across from Valerius now, a goblet of wine in his hand, his expression one of smug satisfaction. "A constitution," he said, swirling the wine. "A brilliant move, Grandmaster. Give them a symbol of victory, and they'll go home content, never realizing that symbols have no power." "Precisely," Valerius said. "The Constitution will be drafted by my hand, ratified by my council, and enforced by my operatives. It will say whatever I need it to say, and it will mean nothing. The people will believe they have won, and they will return to their villages, their fervor spent. The crisis will pass." Tiberius leaned forward. "And what of Kalen and Serafina? They are the heart of this movement. As long as they live, they remain a threat. They will be dealt with," Valerius said coldly, "but not yet. Not while the people are watching. We must wait for the right moment when their martyrdom will not ignite another uprising." He paused, studying Tiberius. "You, however, have your own role to play. You wanted revenge on the Brotherhood for denying you. I am offering you an opportunity. Help me crush this rebellion once and for all, and I will grant you access to the ledger. You will have the power you sought, and I will have the order I require." Tiberius's eyes gleamed. "What do you need from me?" "Soldiers," Valerius said. "Not the city guard, who are too visible, too accountable. I need a force that can act without restraint, that can be deployed and then disavowed. Your connections in the Senate give you access to foreign mercenaries, do they not?" Tiberius smiled. "I can have a legion here within a fortnight, but I want more than to access the ledger, Valerius. I want to control it. Shared control." Valerius's expression darkened, but he nodded slowly. "Agreed. Now let us plan the end of this foolish dream of freedom." The Constitution was drafted and presented to the people 1 week later, in a grand ceremony held in the capital's central plaza. Kalen and Serafina stood on the platform beside Valerius as he read the document aloud, his voice resonant and authoritative. It was a masterpiece of rhetoric, filled with noble language about justice, accountability, and the Brotherhood's sacred duty to serve the people. The crowd listened in rapt attention, and when Valerius finished, they erupted in applause. But as Kalen listened, he heard the gaps, the careful omissions, the clauses that sounded restrictive but were actually toothless. The Constitution established an oversight council, but its members would be appointed by the Grand Master. It required transparency in the Brotherhood's operations, but only in matters deemed appropriate for public disclosure by the Grand Master. It enshrined the people's right to petition for aid, but gave the Brotherhood sole discretion to determine what aid was feasible and prudent. It was a lie wrapped in the language of reform. Serafina saw it too. He could tell by the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched at her sides. But they could say nothing. To denounce the Constitution now, in front of the celebrating crowd, would make them appear ungrateful, divisive. Valerius had outmaneuvered them. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Valerius approached them with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You should be pleased," he said quietly. "You got what you wanted. The Brotherhood is now bound by a charter. The people have their voice." "This isn't what we wanted," Kalen said, his voice low and hard. "This is a performance. You've given them nothing." "I've given them hope," Valerius replied. "And hope, as you've demonstrated, is a powerful tool. It can inspire me. It can also be controlled. You lit a fire, Kalen. I've simply ensured it burns in a direction I choose." He turned and walked away, leaving them standing in the emptying plaza, the weight of their failure settling over them like a shroud. That night, Kalen and Serafina met in secret with a small group of operatives who had supported their cause. Men and women who believed the Brotherhood had lost its way and wanted to see it reformed. Among them was Matthias, the field operative who had reported the villagers' gratitude, and Isla, who had warned them about the people organizing. They gathered in a safe house on the outskirts of the capital, away from the lodge's prying eyes. "The Constitution is a shame," Serafina said without preamble. "Valerius wrote it to sound revolutionary while changing nothing. He still controls everything." Matthias nodded grimly. "The field operatives see it. We're receiving orders to enforce the new charter, but they're identical to what we were doing before. Nothing has changed except the language." "Then we make it change," Kalen said. "We use the Constitution against him. We hold him accountable for the promises he made, even if he never intended to keep them. We document every violation, every broken promise, and we spread the word." The people believed they won a victory. When they realized they were deceived, their anger will be even greater. Isla leaned forward. "That's dangerous. If Valerius realizes we're undermining him again, he won't imprison us. He'll kill us." "He's going to kill us anyway," Serafina said quietly. "The moment the people stop watching, the moment the fervor dies down, we're dead. Our only chance is to keep the pressure on, to keep the people engaged and demand real change. If we stop now, everything we've done is for nothing." The group fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Finally, Matthias spoke, "Then we continue. But we need to be smarter. We need allies within the Brotherhood, people who can protect us when Valerius moves against us." Kalen thought of Master Lucian, the man who had investigated them, but who had also seemed troubled by Valerius's autocracy. "I might know someone," he said, "but approaching him is a risk." "Everything is at risk now," Serafina said. "We take it." Unbeknownst to Kalen and his allies, their safe house meeting was not as secret as they believed. Brother Cassian, an older member of the Brotherhood who had served for over 30 years, watched from the shadows across the street. He had been following Kalen for days, not on Valerius's orders, but on his own initiative. Cassian had always prided himself on his loyalty to the Brotherhood, his commitment to its mission. But the events of the past weeks had shaken him. He had watched the uprising, seen the hope in the people's eyes, and felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in decades, a memory of why he had joined the Brotherhood in the first place. He had been young then, idealistic, believing he could make a difference. Somewhere along the way, that idealism had been buried under layers of pragmatism and obedience. Valerius's leadership had been effective, yes, but it had also been cold, calculating, devoid of the compassion that had once defined the Brotherhood. Cassian had read the Constitution. He had seen through its hollow promises, and he had realized that Valerius had no intention of honoring the spirit of reform. The Grand Master was planning something that would crush the uprising and restore his absolute authority. Cassian did not know the details, but he could feel it in the air, in the way Valerius spoke, in the way the inner circle moved with quiet, grim purpose. He thought of Kalen and Serafina, two young people who had risked everything to do what he had been too cowardly to do, stand up for what was right. If Valerius moved against them, they would not survive. The Brotherhood would return to its corrupted path, and the people's hope would be extinguished. Unless someone acted, unless someone with access to the inner circle, someone Valerius trusted, chose to betray that trust for a greater cause. Cassian turned away from the safe house and walked into the night, his mind made up. He would find a way to protect Kalen and Serafina, even if it costs him everything. Brother Cassian requested an audience with Valerius 3 days after the Constitution's public unveiling. He was granted entry immediately. His decades of loyal service had earned him that privilege. He found the Grand Master in his private chambers, standing before the Ledger of Whispers, his fingers tracing patterns across its glowing surface. Valerius did not turn when Cassian entered, but his voice carried across the room with its usual authority. "Cassian, you've served the Brotherhood longer than most. What brings you to me now?" Cassian closed the door behind him, his heart pounding. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, the words felt heavy on his tongue. "Grand Master, I come to you with concern about Kalen and Serafina." Valerius finally turned, his expression unreadable. What concern? They are planning to undermine the Constitution, Cassian said, forcing his voice to remain steady. I've been observing them. They meet in secret with other operatives, plotting to document violations and incite the people against you. They believe the Constitution is a deception, and they intend to expose it. Valerius's eyes narrowed. You've been spying on them. I've been protecting the Brotherhood, Cassian corrected. They are dangerous, Grandmaster, not because they are malicious, but because they are idealistic. They will not stop until they either reform the Brotherhood or destroy it trying. And if they succeed in turning the people against us again, the chaos will be uncontrollable. Valerius studied him for a long moment, and Cassian felt the weight of that gaze, the cold calculation behind it. What do you propose? The Grandmaster asked. Cassian took a breath. This was the moment, the point of no return. Give me access to the Ledger's command codes. Let me neutralize their network before they can act. I can do it quietly, without bloodshed. They'll be isolated, powerless, and the Brotherhood will be secure. Valerius walked slowly toward Cassian, his hands clasped behind his back. You want me to give you the command codes, the keys to the Brotherhood's most powerful tool. And you expect me to trust that you will use them only to neutralize Kaelin and Seraphina's network. I have served you for 30 years, Cassian said, meeting his gaze. I have never betrayed the Brotherhood. I have never questioned your authority. I am asking for this because I believe it is the only way to prevent a catastrophe. If you move against them openly, the people will see it as tyranny. But if their network simply dissolves, if their allies are quietly reassigned or discredited, the movement will collapse without martyrs. Valerius considered this, his expression thoughtful. You are right that martyrs are dangerous. And you are right that Kaelin and Seraphina must be dealt with carefully. He moved to a locked cabinet and retrieved a small, sealed scroll. These are the secondary command codes. They will give you access to the Ledger's communication and logistics networks, but not to its core functions. Use them to isolate their allies, to disrupt their plans. But do not harm Kaelin or Seraphina directly. I have other plans for them. Cassian took the scroll, his hands trembling slightly. What plans, Grandmaster? That is not your concern, Valerius said, his final tone. Your task is to dismantle their support network. Do so, and you will have my gratitude. Fail, and you will share their fate. He turned back to the Ledger. You are dismissed. Cassian bowed and left the chamber, the scroll clutched tightly in his hand. As he walked through the lodge's corridors, he felt a sick twist in his stomach. He had lied to Valerius. He had no intention of using the codes to harm Kaelin and Seraphina's network. He intended to use them to protect it, to warn them of Valerius's plans, to give them a chance to escape. But he had just made himself a traitor to both sides, and there would be no forgiveness for that. Cassian met with Kaelin and Seraphina that night in the same safe house they had used before. He arrived alone, his face pale and drawn. When he produced the scroll with the command codes, their eyes widened in shock. How did you get this? Seraphina demanded. I told Valerius I would use them to destroy your network, Cassian said quietly. He believed me, because I have never given him reason to doubt my loyalty. But I'm giving them to you instead. These codes will unlock the Ledger's communication systems. You can warn your allies, coordinate your movements, stay ahead of Valerius's plans. Kaelin stared at him, suspicion and hope warring in his expression. Why? Why would you betray Valerius for us? Because I've spent 30 years watching the Brotherhood become something I no longer recognize, Cassian said, his voice heavy with regret. I told myself it was necessary, that Valerius's methods were harsh but effective. But when I saw the people marching, when I saw the hope in their eyes, I remembered why I joined the Brotherhood. And I realized that if I do nothing, if I let Valerius crush that hope, I will have wasted my entire life serving a lie. Seraphina took the scroll, her hands shaking. Valerius will discover this. When he does, he'll kill you. I know, Cassian said, but perhaps my death will mean something. Perhaps it will give you the time you need to finish what you started. He looked at them both, his eyes filled with desperate earnestness. Save the Brotherhood, Kaelin. Save it from itself. That's all I ask. He turned to leave, but Kaelin stopped him. Wait, If you've given us the codes, what will you tell Valerius when he asks for a report? Cassian smiled sadly. I'll tell him the truth. That I failed, that I was too weak, too sentimental. He'll believe that too. He walked out into the night, and Kaelin and Seraphina were left holding the scroll, the weight of Cassian's sacrifice settling over them like a shroud. The city was still celebrating the passage of the Constitution when the foreign legions arrived. They came at dawn, marching through the gates with the precision of professional soldiers, their armor gleaming, their banners bearing the crest of a distant kingdom. The city guard, caught off guard, could only watch as the legion, nearly 2,000 strong, took up positions throughout the capital. Senator Tiberius rode at their head, his expression one of smug triumph. Kaelin was in the safe house when Matthias burst through the door, breathless and terrified. Soldiers, foreign soldiers, they're everywhere. They're surrounding the plaza, the lodge, and the government buildings. And they're asking for a list of names. Your name? Seraphina's face went white. Valerius. He planned this. The Constitution, the release, all of it was to buy time for Tiberius to bring in an army. Kaelin grabbed the scroll Cassian had given them and unfurled it, his eyes scanning the command codes. We can use the ledger to warn the others, to get them out of the city beforehand. The door exploded inward. Legionnaires poured into the safe house, their swords drawn, their movements efficient and brutal. Kaelin and Seraphina were seized before they could react, their hands bound, the scroll torn from Kaelin's grasp. Matthias tried to fight, but a soldier's fist connected with his jaw, and he crumpled to the floor. A captain stepped forward, his face hard and emotionless. Kaelin Thorne and Seraphina Vale, you are under arrest for sedition, conspiracy, and treason against the state. Senator Tiberius has issued a warrant for your execution to be carried out at dawn tomorrow in the central plaza. Resistance is futile. Kaelin struggled against his bonds, his mind racing. The state? What state? We're members of the Brotherhood. You have no authority. The Brotherhood has ceded authority to the Senate in matters of public order, the captain said. By decree of Grand Master Valerius, you will be tried, convicted, and executed. That is the law. Valerius watched from the lodge's high window as the legionnaires dragged Kaelin and Seraphina through the streets. The crowd that had celebrated their release now watched in stunned silence, too shocked to react, too frightened by the armed soldiers to intervene. It was perfect. That means something. It means we weren't alone. It means the Brotherhood isn't entirely lost. They sat in silence for a long time, holding each other in the darkness. Outside, the city waited for dawn, for the execution that would mark the end of the uprising. But in the cell, two people who had dared to defy a tyrant found a fragile peace, knowing that even in failure, they had stood for something greater than themselves. And that, perhaps, was enough. Above them, in his chambers, Valerius prepared the orders for their execution. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a cold, hollow certainty that he had done what was necessary. The Brotherhood would endure. His vision would prevail, and the cost, however high, was justified. Or so he told himself, as he had told himself so many times before. Dawn broke cold and gray over the capital. The central plaza, which had been filled with celebration just days before, now held a scaffold, and a crowd forced into silence by the presence of Tiberius's legionnaires. The soldiers lined the perimeter, their hands on their sword hilts, their eyes scanning for any sign of resistance. There would be none. The people had learned their lesson. Hope was dangerous. Defiance was fatal. Kaelin and Seraphina were led from the dungeon in chains, their faces pale but composed. They walked with their heads high, refusing to give Valerius or Tiberius the satisfaction of seeing them broken. As they climbed the scaffold steps, Kaelin looked out at the crowd and saw faces he recognized. Villagers from Thornhaven, operatives from the Brotherhood, ordinary citizens who had believed in the possibility of change. Their eyes were filled with tears, but with something else too. Anger, determination. The executioner, a hooded figure whose identity was concealed, stood beside the block. Senator Tiberius stepped forward, unrolling a scroll. Kaelin Thorne and Seraphina Vale, he announced, his voice carrying across the silent plaza. You have been found guilty of sedition, conspiracy, and treason. You sought to undermine the lawful authority of the Brotherhood and the Senate. You incited rebellion and endangered the peace of this realm. The sentence is death. Do you have any final words? Kalen and Serafina exchanged a glance. Then Kalen turned to the crowd, his voice clear and strong. We are not traitors. We are the Brotherhood's true heirs. We upheld the oath the founders swore to protect the innocent, to serve the people, not ourselves. If that is treason, then we die guilty. But we die knowing that the truth will outlive us. Remember what we fought for. Remember that power without compassion is tyranny. And never stop hoping for something better. Serafina spoke next, her voice softer but no less powerful. The founders created the Brotherhood in a time of darkness. They bled together and swore an oath that their power would never corrupt their purpose. But power did corrupt it. Valerius forgot the oath. He forgot the people. He forgot that the Brotherhood was meant to be a shield, not a sword. She looked directly at Valerius, who stood on a balcony overlooking the plaza, his face a mask of stone. Grandmaster, you could have been great. You could have led us to be what the founders dreamed. Instead, you chose control over compassion, fear over trust. And now you stand there, watching us die, believing you have won. But you have lost everything that mattered. The crowd stirred, a low murmur of agreement rippling through them. The legionnaires tensed, but no one moved. Tiberius gestured impatiently to the executioner. Enough! Carry out the sentence. Kalen knelt first, placing his head on the block. He closed his eyes, and his last thought was of the villages they had saved, the lives they had touched, the hope they had kindled. The executioner's blade fell, swift and final. The crowd gasped, and several people cried out, but the soldiers kept them in place. Serafina knelt next. She did not close her eyes. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of those who had believed in them, and she smiled. Do not forget, she whispered, too quietly for anyone but the executioner to hear. Do not forget. The blade fell. The plaza erupted in a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a wail, but something deeper. A collective grief, a shared wound. Valerius watched from his balcony, his expression unchanged, but inside something shifted. He had expected to feel vindicated, triumphant. Instead, he felt only a cold, creeping emptiness. The executions were supposed to restore order. But as he looked at the crowd's faces, he saw not submission, but something far more dangerous. Martyrdom. As the crowd was dispersed by the legionnaires, Valerius returned to his chambers. He poured himself a goblet of wine, but it tasted like ash. He had done what was necessary. He had eliminated the threat, crushed the rebellion, and restored his authority. But the victory felt hollow. Kalen's words echoed in his mind. Power without compassion is tyranny. Serafina's accusation, you have lost everything that mattered. He told himself they were fools, idealists who did not understand the complexities of leadership, the burdens of power. But the words would not leave him. He thought of the founders, of the oath they had sworn in that forgotten scriptorium. We swear that this power will never be used for our own glory or gain. Had he broken that oath? Had he become the very thing the Brotherhood was created to oppose? He shook his head, banishing the thoughts. Doubt was a luxury he could not afford. The Brotherhood's survival depended on his strength, his resolve. He had made the hard choices, the choices the founders had been too weak to make. History would vindicate him. It had to. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Master Lucian entered, his face grave. Grandmaster, there's a problem. The executions have not quelled the unrest. If anything, they have inflamed it. Reports are coming in from across the realm. Villages are refusing to cooperate with Brotherhood operatives. Some are openly displaying Kalen and Serafina's names as symbols of resistance. They are being remembered as heroes, not traitors. Valerius's hand tightened around the goblet. Then we remind them of the cost of resistance. We increase enforcement. We make examples. With respect, Grandmaster, Lucian said carefully, we no longer have the resources for that. Tiberius's legion controls the capital. Our own operations are scattered, demoralized. Many are questioning whether the executions were just. We are losing control, not gaining it. Valerius stared at him, the cold emptiness spreading. Then we will take it back, whatever the cost. Within days of the executions, Tiberius's legionnaires began a systematic purge of anyone suspected of sympathizing with Kalen and Serafina's cause. The safe house where they had met was raided, and everyone found there was arrested. Matthias, the field operative who had warned them of the legion's arrival, was dragged from his home in the middle of the night and imprisoned without trial. Ela, who had coordinated aid to the southern provinces, fled the capital but was captured on the road and brought back in chains. The Brotherhood's network, which had operated in secrecy for decades, was being torn apart. Operatives who had once moved freely through the shadows now found themselves hunted, their safe houses compromised, their contacts exposed. Tiberius had gained access to the ledger, part of his bargain with Valerius, and he was using it with ruthless efficiency to identify and eliminate anyone who might threaten his new order. Master Corvus, ever the pragmatist, adapted quickly to the new reality. He met with Tiberius in the Senate chambers, offering his full cooperation in exchange for a position of influence in the new regime. "The Brotherhood's old guard understands the necessity of order," he said, his voice unctuous. "We can help you consolidate power, Senator. We know the networks, the resources, the secrets. Together, we can create a stability that benefits us both." Tiberius smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I appreciate your offer, Master Corvus, but I have learned that the Brotherhood's greatest weakness is its members' divided loyalties. Some serve the Grand Master, some serve the people, some serve only themselves. I prefer a simpler arrangement. You will serve me, or you will join the others in the dungeons." Corvus's smile faltered. He had miscalculated. He had thought Tiberius would need the Brotherhood's expertise, would value their partnership. But Tiberius did not want partners. He wanted servants, and he was willing to destroy anyone who did not submit completely. The Brotherhood's members who had supported Kalin and Seraphina went into hiding. Some fled to the countryside, seeking refuge in the villages they had once helped. Others disappeared into the capital's underbelly, moving through a network of sympathizers who risked their own lives to shelter them. But Tiberius's reach was long, and his methods were brutal. Informants were everywhere, motivated by fear or coin, and the legionnaires showed no mercy. In a small village 50 miles from the capital, a group of Brotherhood operatives had taken refuge in a barn. They were discovered when a local farmer, terrified of being implicated, reported them to the nearest Legion outpost. The legionnaires surrounded the barn at dawn and set it ablaze. The operatives tried to flee, but they were cut down as they emerged, their bodies left in the field as a warning to anyone who might consider harboring fugitives. News of the massacre spread quickly, carried by travelers and merchants. The message was clear. There was no safe haven, no escape. The Brotherhood, once the realm's most powerful secret organization, was being systematically dismantled. And Valerius, who had built that organization into an empire of shadows, could only watch as it crumbled. He called an emergency council meeting, but only half the masters attended. The others had either fled, been arrested, or were too frightened to leave their homes. Those who came looked at Valerius with a mixture of fear and accusation. "You gave Tiberius access to the ledger," Master Lucian said, his voice tight with anger. "You handed him the keys to our entire network, and now he is using it to destroy us." "I gave him limited access," Valerius snapped. "Enough to crush the rebellion, not to dismantle the Brotherhood." "And yet," Lucian said, "that is exactly what is happening. Tiberius does not distinguish between rebels and loyalists. To him, we are all threats, and you gave him the tools to eliminate us." Valerius stood and slammed his fist on the table. "I did what was necessary to preserve order. Kalin and Seraphina's rebellion would have torn the realm apart. I made a calculated alliance to prevent that. If Tiberius is overreaching, we will rein him in." "How?" Lucian demanded. "He controls the capital. He has an army. He has the ledger. What do we have, Grandmaster? A scattered network of terrified operatives and a reputation in ruins. People see us as tyrants. Our own members see us as traitors. We have nothing." The other masters murmured in agreement. Valerius looked around the table, seeing the fear and resentment in their eyes. He had led them for decades, had commanded their absolute loyalty, and now they were questioning him. Worse, they were right to question him. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated Tiberius's ambition and overestimated his own control. The alliance meant to save the Brotherhood was destroying it. "Then we take back control," Valerius said, his voice low and dangerous. "We cut off Tiberius's access to the ledger. We rally our remaining operations. We fight. With what?" Lucian asked. We are outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of options. The only way to stop Tiberius now is to destroy the ledger itself. To take away his greatest weapon, even if it means taking away ours. Valerius stared at him, the suggestion so unthinkable that for a moment he could not respond. Destroy the ledger, the tool the founders had created, the instrument of the Brotherhood's power, the legacy he had spent his life perfecting. Never, he said. The ledger is the Brotherhood. Without it, we are nothing. We are already nothing, Lucian said quietly. The question is whether we will be nothing with honor or nothing with blood on our hands. Before Valerius could respond, the doors burst open. Legionnaires poured into the chamber, their swords drawn. At their head was Tiberius, his expression one of cold satisfaction. Grand Master Valerius, you are under arrest? Valerius was not taken to the dungeon immediately. Instead, Tiberius had him confined to a small, windowless room in the Senate building, a deliberate humiliation. The Grand Master of the Brute Brotherhood, the man who had controlled the fate of nations, was now a prisoner in a room barely large enough to contain a cot and a chamber pot. Tiberius visited him that evening. His expression was one of barely concealed glee. You thought you could use me, Tiberius said, settling into the room's only chair while Valerius remained standing. You thought you could bring me in, let me do your dirty work, and then dismiss me when the crisis passed. But you underestimated me, Grand Master. You underestimated how much I wanted what you had. The ledger, Valerius said, his voice flat. The ledger, Tiberius confirmed. The most powerful tool ever created, and you wielded it like a blunt instrument. You used it to maintain order, to prevent wars, to impose your vision of stability. How pedestrian. I will use it to reshape the world, to elevate those who deserve power and crush those who stand in my way. Starting with you. Valerius met his gaze, and despite his circumstances, there was still steel in his eyes. You will fail. The ledger is not a simple tool. It requires understanding, mastery, and decades of study. You cannot simply seize it and expect to wield it effectively. Tiberius laughed. I don't need to master it myself. I have your operatives, the ones who chose survival over loyalty. Master Corvus, for instance, has been most helpful in explaining the ledger's functions. And if he proves insufficient, well, there are others who can be persuaded. He stood and moved to the door. You will be executed in 3 days, Valerius. Publicly, like your young rebels. People will see that even the mighty can fall. And I will be there to catch the crown when it does. The next day, Valerius was moved to the dungeon beneath the lodge, the same dungeon where Keelan and Seraphina had spent their final days. The irony was not lost on him. He was placed in the very cell they had occupied, the stone walls cold and damp, the thick air with the smell of mold and despair. A single barred window high above let in a sliver of gray light, barely enough to see by. He sat on the stone bench and stared at the walls, his mind churning. How had it come to this? He had been so certain of his path, so convinced that his methods were necessary, that his vision was right. And yet here he was, a prisoner awaiting execution, his life's work crumbling around him. The Brotherhood was scattered, the ledger was in the hands of a tyrant, and the people he had sworn to protect saw him as an oppressor. A sound at the cell door made him look up. A guard opened it, and another prisoner was shoved inside. An older man, his face bruised and bloodied, his hands bound. Valerius recognized him immediately. Brother Cassian. Leave us, Valerius said to the guard, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded for decades. The guard hesitated, then shrugged and locked the door behind him, leaving the two men alone. Cassian slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. Grand Master, he said, his voice hoarse, I did not expect to see you here. Nor I am you, Valerius replied, though perhaps I should have. You betrayed me, Cassian. You gave Keelan and Seraphina the command codes. You chose them over the Brotherhood. Cassian looked up, and despite his injuries, there was a clarity in his eyes that Valerius had not seen before. I chose the Brotherhood, Grand Master, the real Brotherhood, the one the founders created. You had forgotten what that was. I tried to remember for you. Valerius felt a surge of anger, but it was weaker than he expected, diluted by exhaustion and doubt. You tried to remember? You undermined my authority, sabotaged my plans, and helped 2 traitors nearly destroy everything I built. That is not remembering. That is betrayal. Is it? Cassian asked. Or was I the only one still loyal to the oath we swore? You built an empire, Valerius. You built a system of control so vast and so powerful that it could topple kingdoms. But the founders did not create the Brotherhood to topple kingdoms. They created it to protect the powerless, and you forgot them. You forgot the baker's children, the starving villages, the people who had no voice. You forgot why we existed. Valerius wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words would not come. Because Cassian was right. He had forgotten. Somewhere along the way, the mission had changed. People had become obstacles, variables to be managed, not lives to be cherished. I did what was necessary, he said, but the conviction was gone from his voice. Necessary for what? Cassian asked. For order? For stability? Or for your own pride? You could not bear the thought of losing control, admitting that the founder's way might still work. So you turned the ledger into a weapon, and you turned yourself into a tyrant. And now we are both here, waiting to die, because neither of us had the courage to stop you sooner. The cell fell silent. Valerius stared at the floor, Cassian's words echoing in his mind. They carved messages, Cassian said suddenly, his voice softer. Kaelin and Seraphina, in the walls. I saw them when they brought me in. They knew they were going to die, and they left words of hope. Not anger, not curses. Hope. He gestured weakly to the wall behind Valerius. Read them, Grandmaster. Maybe they will teach you what I could not. After Cassian was taken away, dragged to another cell, or perhaps to his own execution, Valerius was left alone. He sat in the darkness for a long time, too numb to move, too exhausted to think. But eventually, Cassian's words drew him to the wall. He ran his hands over the cold stone, searching for the carvings. It took time, but he found them. Faint scratches etched with a nail or a piece of metal, barely visible in the dim light. The first message was in Kaelin's hand, the letters uneven but legible. We die knowing we tried. That is enough. To whoever reads this, do not let our deaths be the end. Let them be the beginning. The Brotherhood can still be what it was meant to be. Believe. Valerius traced the words with his fingers, feeling the rough edges of the stone. Kaelin had faced death with hope. He had believed, even at the end, that the Brotherhood could be redeemed. Valerius had watched him die, had felt nothing but cold satisfaction, and now those words burned in his mind like a brand. The second message was Seraphina's, her script smaller and more precise. Forgive them. Forgive Valerius. Forgive Tiberius. Forgive Cassian. Forgive ourselves. Anger is a chain. Forgiveness is freedom. The founders knew this. We must remember. Valerius's breath caught in his throat. Forgive them. Forgive Valerius. She had forgiven him. Even as she knelt on the scaffold, even as the blade fell, she had forgiven him. And he had learned nothing from it. He had continued on his path, convinced of his righteousness, blind to the cost. He sank to his knees, his hands pressed against the wall, and for the first time in decades, Grandmaster Valerius wept. Not for himself, not for his lost power, but for the lives he had destroyed, the people he had failed, the oath he had broken. He wept for Kaelin and Seraphina, for Cassian, for the founders whose vision he had corrupted. And he wept for the man he had become. The next day, Tiberius came to the cell. He found Valerius sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes red but clear. Tomorrow is your execution, Tiberius said. I thought you might want to know. It will be a grand affair. The people are eager to see the tyrant brought low. I've even prepared a speech about the dangers of unchecked power. Ironic, isn't it? Valerius looked up at him, and Tiberius was surprised to see not fear or anger, but something else. Pity. You think you've won, Valerius said quietly. You think taking the ledger makes you powerful, but you're wrong. The ledger is not a power. It's a burden, and it will consume you just as it consumed me, Tiberius sneered. I am not you, Valerius. I will not make mistakes. I will not be weakened by sentiment or doubt. I will use the ledger as it was meant to be used, to dominate, to control, to rule. That is not what it was meant for, Valerius said. The founders created it to protect, not to dominate. I forgot that. I turned it into a weapon, and it destroyed everything I cared about. You will do the same. And when you fall, and you will fall, you will understand what I understand now. That power without purpose is just cruelty, and cruelty always devours itself. Tiberius stared at him, unnerved by the calm certainty in his voice. You're trying to manipulate me, to plant seeds of doubt. It won't work. I'm not trying to manipulate you, Valerius said. I'm trying to warn you, but you won't listen. I didn't listen when others tried to warn me either. Pride is a powerful blindness. He turned back to the wall, to the messages carved there. Go, Tiberius. Enjoy your victory. It will be shorter than you think. Tiberius left, slamming the cell door behind him, but Valerius's words lingered, a whisper of doubt he could not quite silence. That night, Valerius could not sleep. He sat in the darkness, staring at the carved messages, and thought about his life. He had been so certain of his path, so convinced that his methods were necessary. But necessity, he realized now, was just another word for cowardice. He had been too afraid to trust the people, too afraid to let go of control, too afraid to believe that compassion could be as powerful as fear. The founders had trusted. They had created the ledger, not as a tool of domination, but as a tool of service. They had sworn an oath that power would never corrupt their purpose. And he had broken that oath slowly, incrementally, justifying each compromise, each betrayal, until he no longer recognized what he had become. But it was not too late, not entirely. He would die tomorrow, but he could die with honor. He could die having learned the lesson Kaelin and Seraphina had tried to teach him. He could die having chosen forgiveness over vengeance, humility over pride. It would not undo the harm he had caused, would not bring back the dead, would not restore the Brotherhood. But it would be something, a small light in the darkness, a final act of grace. He thought of the founders, of the 5 men who had bled together in a forgotten scriptorium and sworn to protect the innocent. He thought of their oath, the words he had memorized as a young man and then forgotten. We swear to protect the innocent, to defy the darkness, and to serve the people, not ourselves. And we swear that this power we create will never be used for our own glory or gain. He whispered the words aloud, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I forgot, but I remember now. And tomorrow I will show them that I remember. Outside, the city slept, unaware that in a dungeon cell, a tyrant was becoming a man again. The morning of Valerius's execution arrived, and the capital was once again filled with a tense, expectant crowd. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Word had spread of Valerius's arrest, of Tiberius's seizure of power, of the Brotherhood's collapse. The people did not know what to feel. Valerius had been a tyrant, yes, but he had also been a symbol of order, of stability. And Tiberius, for all his promises of reform, was proving to be something worse, despot, without even the pretense of principle. Valerius was led to the scaffold in chains, his head unbowed, his expression serene. The crowd murmured in surprise. They had expected to see a broken man, a tyrant humbled by his fall. Instead, they saw someone who seemed almost at peace. Tiberius stood on the platform, ready to deliver his prepared speech, but Valerius's calm demeanor unnerved him. Grand Master Valerius, Tiberius began, his voice ringing across the plaza, you stand accused of tyranny, of abusing the power entrusted to you, of betraying the people you swore to serve. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Valerius looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people he had tried to control, to protect, to manage. He saw fear, anger, and confusion, but he also saw hope, fragile, battered, but still alive. I have no defense, he said, his voice clear and strong. I am guilty of everything you accuse me of. I became a tyrant. I forgot the oath I swore. I betrayed the founders' vision and the people's trust. I deserve this fate. The crowd fell silent, shocked by his admission. Tiberius frowned, sensing that something was slipping out of his control. Then you accept your sentence? I accept it, Valerius said. But I have one request. Let me speak. Let me say what I should have said long ago. Tiberius hesitated. Allowing Valerius to speak was a risk. The man was a master manipulator, and even in defeat, he might find a way to turn the crowd against him. But refusing would make Tiberius appear afraid, weak. Speak then, he said, but be brief. Valerius turned to face the crowd fully, his chains clinking softly. I stand before you as a cautionary tale. I was given power to protect you, and I used it to control you. I was given sacred trust, and I broke it. I told myself that my methods were necessary, that order required sacrifice, that compassion was a luxury we could not afford. But I was wrong. I was a coward, too afraid to trust you, too proud to admit my mistakes. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. 2 young people, Kaelin Thorne and Seraphina Vale, tried to show me the truth. They reminded me of the oath the founders swore, the purpose for which the Brotherhood was created, and I had them killed for it. I watched them die, believing I had won. But they won, because they died with hope, with forgiveness, with grace. And I lived with only bitterness and pride. The crowd was utterly silent now, hanging on his every word. Valerius continued, "In my cell I found messages they carved into the stone, messages of hope and forgiveness. They forgave me, even though I condemned them. They forgave the man who betrayed them, Brother Cassian, who gave his life trying to protect them. They forgave everyone because they understood what I did not, that forgiveness is not weakness, it is the only true strength." He looked directly at Tiberius. "And so I forgive you, Senator. I forgive you for your ambition, for your cruelty, for seizing power and using it as I did. I forgive Brother Cassian for his betrayal, because it was not betrayal. It was loyalty to something greater than me. And I beg the world to forgive me." The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a confused, emotional roar. Some wept, some shouted, some simply stood in stunned silence. Tiberius's face went white with rage. "Enough!" he shouted. "Executioner, carry out the sentence." But the executioner hesitated, looking at Valerius with something like respect. The crowd's mood was shifting, becoming unpredictable. Tiberius realized too late that he had made a mistake. Valerius's speech had not been a defense. It had been a confession, a transformation, a final act of redemption. And the people, who had come to see a tyrant humbled, were now seeing a man redeemed. Valerius knelt at the block, his eyes closed, his lips moving in a silent prayer. The executioner raised the blade, but before it could fall, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Stop!" It was Alara, the young woman from Thornhaven, pushing her way to the front. "This man was a tyrant, yes! But he has confessed. He repented, and he has shown us something Tiberius never will, the courage to admit he was wrong." Others joined her, their voices rising. "Kalin and Seraphina forgave him. Who are we to demand his death? Tiberius is the real tyrant now. Free Brotherhood! Free Valerius!" Tiberius gestured frantically to his legionnaires. "Disperse them! Arrest anyone who resists!" But the crowd was too large, too agitated. The legionnaires hesitated, unwilling to slaughter unarmed citizens. The moment hung in the balance. And then, from the edges of the plaza, figures emerged. Brotherhood operatives, the ones who had survived the purge, the ones who had been hiding, waiting. They moved through the crowd, not with weapons, but with purpose. Master Lucian was among them, his face grim but determined. "The Brotherhood stands with the people," he declared. "Not with tyrants. Not anymore." The plaza erupted into chaos, and in the confusion, Valerius was pulled from the scaffold, disappearing into the crowd. The uprising began again, but this time, it would not be so easily crushed. The surviving Brotherhood members spirited Valerius through the chaos of the plaza, using the same network of safe houses and hidden passages that had once served their clandestine operations. They brought him to a warehouse on the city's outskirts, where Master Lucian, Matthias, Isla, and a dozen other operators had gathered. The mood was tense, urgent. They had saved Valerius from execution, but they had also ignited a confrontation with Tiberius that could only end in bloodshed. Valerius stood before them, still in his prison clothes, his chains removed, but the marks of captivity still visible on his wrists. He looked around at the faces, some he recognized, some he did not. All of them looked at him with a mixture of wariness and hope. "Why did you save me?" he asked quietly. "I am the reason the Brotherhood fell. I am the reason Kalin and Seraphina are dead." Master Lucian stepped forward. "You are also the reason the Brotherhood existed at all. You built it, shaped it, gave it power. Yes, you corrupted it, but your speech on the scaffold showed us something we had forgotten, that even the most fallen can rise again. We saved you because we believe in redemption, and because we need you." "Need me for what?" Valerius asked. "To destroy the ledger," Lucian said. The room fell silent. "Tiberius controls it now. He is using it to consolidate power, to hunt us, to turn the Brotherhood's own tools against the people. As long as the ledger exists, it will be a weapon in the hands of tyrants. The founders built a failsafe, a way to unmake it, to erase its knowledge and shatter its mechanisms. But it requires the Grand Master's authority. It requires you." Valerius stared at him. The weight of the request settled over him. "You want me to destroy the very thing I spent my life perfecting, the legacy of the founders." The Brotherhood's greatest achievement. Its greatest mistake, Lucian corrected gently, and the only way to truly honor Keelan and Seraphina's sacrifice. Valerius walked to the warehouse's window and looked out at the city. Smoke rose from several fires set in the district during the chaos in the plaza. Tiberius's legionnaires moved through the streets, enforcing a brutal curfew and arresting anyone suspected of sympathizing with the uprising. The capital was a powder keg, and the fuse was already lit. "If I destroy the ledger," he said slowly, "the Brotherhood loses its power. We become ordinary men and women, with no advantage, no leverage, no way to influence events. We become what the founders intended," Matthias said from across the room. "Servants, not masters. Protectors, not manipulators. Isn't that what you said on the scaffold? That you had forgotten the oath?" Valerius turned back to face them. "I did forget. And I remember now, but destroying the ledger will not stop Tiberius. He has an army. He has the Senate's backing. He has already consolidated power. Without the ledger, we have nothing to fight him with." "We have the people," Ela said. "They rose up for Kalen and Seraphina. They rose up for you. They are ready to fight, not for power, but for freedom. That is stronger than any ledger." Valerius wanted to believe her, but he had spent too many years manipulating the levers of power to trust in the people's will. And yet Kalen and Seraphina had trusted. They had believed that compassion and hope could change the world, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. And they had been right? Their deaths had ignited something that his decades of control had never managed to: genuine movement, born not of fear but of shared purpose. "If we do this," he said, "if we destroy the ledger, there is no going back. The Brotherhood as we know it ends. We will be hunted, powerless, with no guarantee of victory." "Then we will be hunted with honor," Lucian said. "And if we fall knowing we chose principle over power. That is enough." Valerius closed his eyes, and for a moment he heard the founders' voices and felt the weight of their oath. "Then let us end this. Let us destroy the ledger." The plan was audacious and desperate. The ledger was housed in the Grand Lodge, now heavily guarded by Tiberius's legionnaires. To reach it, they would need to infiltrate the very heart of the enemy's power. But the Brotherhood still had one advantage: knowledge. They knew the Lodge's secret passages, its hidden entrances, its vulnerabilities. And they had Valerius, whose authority, even stripped of official power, still commanded respect among some of the Lodge's staff. They would strike at dawn when the guard rotations were changing and attention was divided. A small team, Valerius, Lucian, Matthias, and Ila, would enter through the catacombs beneath the lodge, make their way to the ledger's chamber, and activate the failsafe. Meanwhile, the rest of the operatives would create diversions throughout the city, drawing Tiberius's forces away from the lodge. "It's a suicide mission," Matthias said bluntly. "Even if we reach the ledger, Tiberius will have guards stationed there. We'll be outnumbered, outarmed, and trapped. Then we make it count," Valerius said. "The failsafe takes time to activate, nearly 10 minutes. We need to hold the chamber for that long. If we succeed, the ledger is destroyed and Tiberius loses its greatest weapon. If we fail, we die knowing we tried." As Kalen said, that is enough. The team spent the remaining hours preparing. They gathered what weapons they could: swords, daggers, and a few crossbows. They reviewed the lodge's layout, memorizing every turn, every passage. And they said their goodbyes, knowing many would not return. Valerius found himself standing beside Lucian, the man who had served him for decades, who had questioned him, challenged him, and ultimately saved him. "Thank you," Valerius said quietly, "for not giving up on me, for believing I could be more than what I became." Lucian placed a hand on his shoulder. "The founders believed in redemption, Grandmaster. So do I. Now let us prove them right." As dawn approached, the team descended into the catacombs, and the final battle for the Brotherhood's soul began. The catacombs beneath the Grand Lodge were a maze of ancient tunnels carved centuries before the Brotherhood's founding. Valerius led the team through the darkness, his memory of the passages still sharp despite his years of imprisonment. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth, their breathing controlled. Above them, they could hear the muted sounds of the city waking, the tramp of legionnaires' boots, the distant shouts of officers, the creak of gates opening. They emerged in the lodge's lower levels. in a storage room filled with old records and forgotten relics. Matthias checked the door, peering through a crack. 2 guards in the corridor. We'll need to take them quietly. Isla and Matthias moved first, their movements swift and precise. The guards were subdued before they could raise an alarm, bound and gagged and left in the storage room. The team continued, climbing the narrow servant staircases that led to the upper floors. They encountered 3 more guards along the way, each dispatched with the same efficiency. But Valerius knew their luck would not hold. The closer they got to the ledger's chamber, the heavier the security would be. They reached the final corridor, and Valerius's heart sank. The chamber's entrance was guarded by a full squad of 10 legionnaires, armored and alert. There was no way to approach unseen, no way to take them quietly. Lucian looked at Valerius, his expression grim. "We fight," Valerius nodded. He had not held a sword in years, but the weight of it in his hand felt familiar, almost comforting. "For the founders," he said, "for Kaelin and Seraphina. For the Brotherhood's true purpose. For redemption," Lucian added. They charged. The corridor erupted into chaos, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the spray of blood. The legionnaires were trained soldiers, but the Brotherhood operatives fought with a desperation born of purpose. Matthias fell first, a sword through his chest, but he took 2 legionnaires with him. Isla fought like a demon, her twin daggers flashing until a spear pierced her side. Valerius and Lucian fought side by side, their movements synchronized from years of working together. They cut through the guards, their blades finding gaps in armor, their strikes driven by a fury that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with atonement. When the last legionnaire fell, they stood panting in the corridor, surrounded by bodies. Matthias and Isla were dead. They had paid the price for this moment. "We don't have much time," Lucian said, his voice strained. He had taken a wound to his shoulder, blood seeping through his tunic. "Tiberius will have heard the fighting. Reinforcements will be here soon." They entered the ledger's chamber. The device stood at the center, its crystalline heart pulsing with light, its brass rings spinning slowly. It was beautiful, terrible, a monument to human ingenuity and human hubris. Valerius approached it, his hands trembling. This was the tool the founders had created to save lives, and he had turned it into an instrument of control. Now he would unmake it. He placed his hands on the primary interface and began the sequence. The ledger responded to his authority, its mechanisms shifting, its light growing brighter. A countdown appeared in the air above the court sphere. 10 minutes. "It's started," he said. "We just need to hold this room." The door burst open. Tiberius strode in, flanked by a dozen more legionnaires. His face was twisted with rage. "You," he spat, pointing at Valerius. "You think you can destroy my power? You think you can take from me what I have earned?" "It was never yours," Valerius said calmly. "It was never mine. It belongs to no one. That is the lesson I learned too late. But I will not let you repeat my mistakes." Tiberius drew his sword. "Then you will die here, Valerius, and your precious ledger will remain mine." "No," Valerius said, "it will not." He raised his own sword. "Lucian, guard the ledger. I will hold them." The fight was brutal and short. Valerius was old, wounded, and exhausted, but he fought with a clarity he had never known. Every strike was purposeful, every movement deliberate. He was not fighting for power or pride. He was fighting for redemption, for the chance to make one thing right in a life filled with wrongs. He cut down 2 legionnaires, then a third, but there were too many. A blade slashed across his side, and he staggered. Another caught his leg, and he fell to one knee. Tiberius stood over him, his sword raised. "You were a great man once, Valerius, but you threw it all away for sentiment, for weakness." Valerius looked up at him, blood streaming from his wounds, and smiled. "No, I threw it away for pride. I am reclaiming it now with humility." He glanced at the ledger. The countdown read 3 minutes. "You cannot stop it, Tiberius. Even if you kill me, the sequence is irreversible. The ledger will be destroyed. Your power ends today." Tiberius's face contorted with fury. He raised his sword to deliver the killing blow, but before he could strike, Lucian threw himself between them, taking the blade meant for Valerius. He crumpled to the ground, his eyes meeting Valerius's one last time. "Finish it," he gasped. "Finish what we started." Valerius crawled to the ledger, his vision blurring, his strength fading. The countdown read 1 minute. Tiberius and his legionnaires tried to stop him, but the device's mechanisms were already collapsing, its light flaring, its rings spinning wildly. "No!" Tiberius screamed, reaching for the controls, but it was too late. The ledger of whispers shattered. The quartz sphere exploded in a burst of light. The brass rings flew apart, and the knowledge of 2 generations, the secrets, the power, the corruption, was erased in an instant. Valerius collapsed beside it, his hand resting on the broken remnants. "It is done," he whispered. "Forgive me. Forgive us all." And then darkness. The explosion of the ledger sent a shockwave through the Grand Lodge, shattering windows and shaking the foundations. Tiberius was thrown back, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. When he staggered to his feet, he saw only wreckage. The ledger reduced to twisted metal and shattered crystal, Valerius lying motionless beside it, Lucian's body sprawled nearby. The chamber was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burned metal. "No," Tiberius whispered, then screamed. "No! You've destroyed everything." He turned to his legionnaires. "Find the operatives who helped him. Find them and kill them all. I want every member of the Brotherhood hunted down and executed." But even as he gave the orders, he knew it was futile. Without the ledger, he had no way to track the Brotherhood's members, no way to intercept their communications, no way to predict their movements. He was blind, powerless, reduced to a man with an army, but no intelligence. The very tool that had made him formidable was gone, and with it, his advantage. Outside the lodge, the city was in full revolt. The diversions the Brotherhood had created had sparked genuine uprisings throughout the capital. The people, emboldened by Valerius's speech and the news of his escape, were rising against Tiberius's occupation. Barricades appeared in the streets, legionnaires were ambushed and disarmed, and the cry of freedom echoed from every district. Tiberius fled the lodge, his legionnaires forming a protective cordon around him. But as they moved through the streets, they were met with a hail of stones, arrows, and improvised weapons. The people were no longer afraid. They had seen a tyrant confess, had seen the Brotherhood sacrifice itself for their freedom, and they would not be cowed again. Tiberius's grip on the capital was slipping, and he knew it. Within days, he would be forced to retreat, his ambitions shattered, his name cursed. The ledger was broken, and with it, his dreams of dominion. In the wreckage of the ledger's chamber, a figure stirred. Valerius was not dead, though he was close. His wounds were grievous, his breathing shallow, but he clung to life with stubborn determination. He opened his eyes and saw the shattered remains of the device he had spent his life mastering. It was gone, truly finally gone, and with it, the corruption it represented. A hand touched his shoulder. He turned his head, expecting to see Tiberius or a legionnaire, but instead he saw a young woman, one of the Brotherhood's junior operatives, someone he did not recognize. "Grand Master," she said softly, "we need to move you." "The lodge is not safe. Leave me," Valerius whispered. "I am finished. Let me die here, where it ended." "No," the woman said firmly. "You do not get to choose martyrdom now. You chose redemption. That means living with what you have done, bearing witness to what comes next. People need to see that even the fallen can rise. You owe them that." Valerius wanted to argue, but he had no strength left. The woman and 2 others lifted him carefully, carrying him through the lodge's secret passages, away from the chaos, away from Tiberius's wrath. They brought him to a safe house in the lower city, where a healer tended his wounds. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with images of Kalin and Seraphina, of the founders, of the oath he had broken and finally honored. When he woke up, days later, the city was quiet. The uprising had succeeded. Tiberius had fled, his legionnaires scattered or surrendered. The Senate had dissolved, its members arrested or in hiding, and the people, for the first time in generations, were free to choose their own path. The Brotherhood, what remained of it, had faded back into the shadows, no longer puppet masters, but quiet guardians, serving without seeking power. The founder's vision at last was restored. Valerius recovered slowly, his body healing, but his spirit forever changed. He did not return to the Grand Lodge, did not seek to reclaim his title or authority. He was no longer the Grand Master. He was simply a man who had learned too late the cost of pride and the gift of forgiveness. He spent his remaining days in quiet service, helping to rebuild the communities the Brotherhood had neglected, offering counsel to those who sought it and bearing witness to the new world that Kaelin and Seraphina's sacrifice had made possible. One evening, as the sun set over the capital, he stood in the plaza where the executions had taken place. A monument had been erected there, a simple stone pillar carved with the names of those who had died for the cause of freedom. Kaelin Thorne, Seraphina Vale, Matthias, Isla, Lucian, Brother Cassian, and dozens of others, known and unknown, who had given their lives so that others might be free. Valerius placed a hand on the stone, his fingers tracing Kaelin's name. "You were right," he whispered. "You were right, and I was wrong. I hope, wherever you are, you can forgive me. I hope the founders can forgive me. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn that forgiveness." A voice spoke behind him. "They already have." He turned and saw Alara, the young woman from Thornhaven, now a leader in the new provisional government. "Your speech, your sacrifice, your choice to destroy the ledger, it changed everything. You are not remembered as a tyrant, Grand Master. You are remembered as the man who chose redemption." Valerius shook his head. "I do not deserve that. None of us deserves the grace we are given," Alara said gently. "But we accept it, and we try to be worthy of it. That is all any of us can do." Valerius looked back at the monument, at the names of the dead, and he felt, for the first time in decades, a fragile, tentative peace. The ledger was broken, the Brotherhood was reborn, and he, the fallen Grand Master, had been given a second chance. It was enough. 10 years have passed since the Ledger of Whispers was destroyed. The capital had been rebuilt, not as a monument to power, but as a testament to resilience. The Grand Lodge still stood, but it was no longer the seat of a shadow empire. It had been transformed into a library and a school, open to all, where the history of the Brotherhood, both its triumphs and its failures, was taught without embellishment or apology. The founder's oath was inscribed above the entrance, a reminder of the principles that should guide those who sought to serve. In a small village 200 miles from the capital, a woman named Ilara stood before a gathering of children, teaching them to read. The schoolhouse was modest, built with funds donated by the new provisional government and staffed by volunteers. Alara had left politics years ago, preferring the quiet work of education to the noise of governance. She believed, as Kaelin and Seraphina had believed, that true change began not with grand gestures but with small acts of compassion repeated over time. One of the children raised her hand. "Teacher Alara, is it true that the Brotherhood used to be evil?" Alara smiled gently. "Not evil, child. Lost. They forgot why they existed, and they became something they were never meant to be. But people, even organizations, can change. They can remember. They can choose a better path." "Like Grandmaster Valerius?" another child asked. "My father says he was a tyrant who became a hero." "Your father is wise," Alara said. "Valerius was both. He was a man who made terrible mistakes, but who found the courage to admit them and to change. That is the hardest thing any of us can do, to look at ourselves honestly and choose to be better. That is the lesson the Brotherhood teaches us now." The children nodded, their young faces serious. Alara looked out the window at the village, at the fields that had been saved by Kaelin and Seraphina's defiance, and she felt a quiet gratitude. The world was not perfect, but it was better. And that was enough. In the capital, the monument to the fallen stood in the center of the plaza, surrounded by flowers left by visitors. People came from across the realm to pay their respects, to remember the names carved in stone, to reflect on the cost of freedom. Among the visitors on this particular day was an old man, his hair white, his movements slow but deliberate. He walked with a cane, his body bearing the scars of a life lived in conflict and redemption. Valerius came to the monument every year on the anniversary of the executions. He would stand before it, silent and still, and remember. He remembered Kaelin's defiant hope, Seraphina's grace, Cassian's sacrifice, Lucian's loyalty, and the countless others who had died because of his pride. He remembered the founder's oath, the one he had broken, and then, at the end, honored. And he remembered the lesson that had cost so many lives, that power without compassion was tyranny, and that forgiveness was the only true strength. A young man approached him, his expression respectful. "Grandmaster Valerius?" Valerius shook his head. "Just Valerius. I am no longer a Grandmaster. That title died with the ledger. Forgive me, the young man said. I am a student at Lodge, the new Lodge, the school. I am studying the Brotherhood's history. I wanted to ask you, do you regret it? Destroying the ledger? Giving up all that power? Valerius looked at him, and his eyes, though aged, were clear. Every day, I regret the choices that made its destruction necessary. But the destruction itself? No, the ledger was a tool, and like all tools, it reflected the intentions of those who wielded it. In my hands, it became a weapon. In Tiberius's hands, it would have become a chain. It was better to break it, to trust in humanity's capacity for goodness, rather than rely on a machine's capacity for control. But without it, how do we ensure justice? How do we protect the innocent? The same way the founders intended, Valerius said, with courage, compassion, and sacrifice. Not from the shadows, but in the light. As the sun set, Valerius left the plaza and walked through the city streets. He passed through markets where merchants traded freely, squares where people gathered to debate, homes where families lived without fear of secret police or midnight arrests. The world was not perfect. There was still injustice, still suffering, still conflict. But it was a world where people had a voice, where power was not concentrated in the hands of a few, where hope was not a luxury, but a right. He made his way to a small chapel on the city's edge, a place of quiet reflection maintained by the remnants of the Brotherhood. Inside, a handful of men and women gathered, not as masters and operatives, but as equals. They were the new Brotherhood, a shadow of its former self in size and influence, but truer to its founding purpose. They met not to plot or scheme, but to coordinate aid, to share resources, to serve without seeking recognition. Valerius took his place among them, and they began their meeting with the founder's oath, speaking in unison. We swear to protect the innocent, to defy the darkness, and to serve the people, not ourselves. And we swear that this power we create will never be used for our own glory or gain. When the meeting ended, Valerius remained behind, alone in the chapel. He knelt before a simple altar, his hands clasped, his head bowed. Kalen, Seraphina, Cassian, Lucian, all of you who died because I forgot what mattered, I carry your names with me. I carry your sacrifice, and I swear, on whatever time I have left, to honor it, to be the man you believed I could be, to serve, not to rule, to protect, not to control, to remember always that we are shadows born from chaos, and our purpose is to bring light, not to hoard it. He rose slowly, his body aching, his heart at peace. Outside, the city lights began to glow, one by one, like candles in the darkness, and Valerius walked into the night, a shadow among shadows, no longer a master, but a servant. And that at last was enough. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and prepare yourself, for there are many more echoes to be heard, many more mysteries to be solved, and a great, glorious future to be won. The age of humanity is dawning, and it will be an age of wonders. Please subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Not from the shadows, but in the light. As the sun set, Valerius left the plaza and walked through the city streets. He passed through markets where merchants traded freely, squares where people gathered to debate, homes where families lived without fear of secret police or midnight arrests. The world was not perfect. There was still injustice, still suffering, still conflict. But it was a world where people had a voice, where power was not concentrated in the hands of a few, where hope was not a luxury, but a right. He made his way to a small chapel on the city's edge, a place of quiet reflection maintained by the remnants of the Brotherhood. Inside, a handful of men and women gathered, not as masters and operatives, but as equals. They were the new Brotherhood, a shadow of its former self in size and influence, but truer to its founding purpose. They met not to plot or scheme, but to coordinate aid, to share resources, to serve without seeking recognition. Valerius took his place among them, and they began their meeting with the founder's oath, speaking in unison. We swear to protect the innocent, to defy the darkness, and to serve the people, not ourselves. And we swear that this power we create will never be used for our own glory or gain. When the meeting ended, Valerius remained behind, alone in the chapel. He knelt before a simple altar, his hands clasped, his head bowed. Kalen, Seraphina, Cassian, Lucian, all of you who died because I forgot what mattered, I carry your names with me. I carry your sacrifice, and I swear, on whatever time I have left, to honor it, to be the man you believed I could be, to serve, not to rule, to protect, not to control, to remember always that we are shadows born from chaos, and our purpose is to bring light, not to hoard it. He rose slowly, his body aching, his heart at peace. Outside, the city lights began to glow, one by one, like candles in the darkness, and Valerius walked into the night, a shadow among shadows, no longer a master, but a servant. And that at last was enough. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and prepare yourself, for there are many more echoes to be heard, many more mysteries to be solved, and a great, glorious future to be won. The age of humanity is dawning, and it will be an age of wonders. Please subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Please subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.